Somewhere around 6,200 years ago, something happened to human civilization. We don't know exactly what. We don't know exactly how. But we know this. All across the planet, in places that had no contact with each other, no shared language, no trade routes, no possible way of communicating, people started telling the same story. A story about water rising until it swallowed the world. A story about a good man warned in advance, building something to survive what was coming. A story about starting over. In Mesopotamia, they carved it into clay tablets. In Egypt, they whispered about a golden age before time itself. In India, the sages wrote of a fish that grew impossibly large and warned a king named Manu. In China, they told of a flood so vast that a hero spent 13 years just trying to control the water. In Mesoamerica, the Maya wrote of a great destruction, a world remade from nothing. In Australia, Aboriginal communities describe events from their Dreamtime that some researchers believe encode memories of rising seas and vanishing coastlines, stretching back further than almost anything else in oral history. Now, if you're just now pressing play, drifting off somewhere with your eyes already getting heavy, that's exactly where I want you. This is a History for Sleep episode, which means we're going slow tonight. No rushing, no urgency, just a long, quiet walk through one of the strangest mysteries in human history. The kind of mystery that sits at the edge of science and legend, where you're not always sure which side of that edge you're standing on. Before we go further, if you're listening on Spotify right now, thank you. Genuinely, it helps this show more than you'd probably guess. And if you're not on Spotify yet, there's a link waiting for you in the description. It costs nothing. It takes about 10 seconds, and it means these episodes keep getting made, night after night, for whoever needs them. And since so many of you are scattered across so many time zones right now, tell me where you're listening from. Drop it in the comments. Your city, your country, whatever feels right and what time it is for you. I read these, I really do. It's strange and kind of wonderful scrolling through and seeing someone in Manila at sunrise, someone in Toronto just before midnight, someone in Cape Town on their lunch break, all listening to the same words at completely different moments. It makes the world feel smaller somehow, more connected, which, funny enough, is sort of the whole theme of tonight's story. Because here's the question we're going to sit with for the next while. If ancient cultures on nearly every continent, separated by oceans and mountains and thousands of miles, independently preserved stories about the same kind of catastrophic event around the same rough window of time, what does that mean? Coincidence? Shared psychology? Or is it possible, and I want to stress possible here, that something really did happen around 4200 BC? Something big enough, something disruptive enough, that it left a mark not just in the ground, but in memory itself, passed down mouth to mouth, generation to generation, until it was written into the Bible, carved into Sumerian tablets, painted onto Egyptian temple walls. Tonight we're going to travel. Slowly. Mesopotamia first, where the oldest written flood story on Earth still survives on broken clay. Then Egypt, where priests spoke of a forgotten first time. Then India. Then China. Then across the ocean to the Americas. And finally to Australia, where some of the oldest continuous oral traditions on the planet might be preserving something almost unthinkable. A folk memory of the world before and the world after. Let's start at the beginning, or at least the beginning of what the evidence can actually show us. Let's start at the beginning, or at least the beginning of what the evidence can actually show us. Picture the world around 6,500 years ago. Not the world of pyramids and empires, not yet. This is earlier than that. Quieter than that, but not empty. Not primitive in the way we sometimes imagine when we think of the distant past. By this point, human beings had been farming for roughly 4,000 years already. Slowly, patiently, in scattered pockets across the globe, people had figured out something extraordinary. That you could plant a seed and return later to find food waiting for you. That you didn't have to follow the herds anymore, didn't have to move with the seasons like your ancestors had for hundreds of thousands of years. You could stay, you could build something permanent. In Mesopotamia, along the rivers we now call the Tigris and Euphrates, small farming villages were growing into something larger, something that would eventually become cities, though nobody living then would have used that word. In the region we now call the Fertile Crescent, wheat and barley had been domesticated for millennia. Sheep and goats had been tamed. People were living in mud brick houses, storing grain in communal pits, developing the early stirrings of what would become organized society. In the Nile Valley, similar changes were underway. The river flooded every year with a rhythm so reliable, so predictable, that entire communities had learned to plan their lives around it. Plant when the waters recede, harvest before they return. It was a partnership between human beings and a river, one that would eventually give rise to one of the most enduring civilizations the world has ever known. But in 4200 BC, that civilization was still centuries away. What existed instead were farming settlements, growing steadily, quietly, along the fertile banks. Over in what is now Turkey, something even stranger had been happening. At a place called Gobekli Tepe, people who supposedly hadn't even invented agriculture yet had built massive stone structures, carved with animals and symbols whose meanings we still don't fully understand. We'll come back to that place later in this journey, because what happened to it, or perhaps more accurately, what happened around it, is part of this same strange puzzle. But for now, just hold on to this thought. Even before farming had fully taken root, human beings were capable of extraordinary things. Cooperation on a massive scale, shared belief systems complex enough to motivate the moving of stones weighing many tons. This wasn't a world of scattered simpletons scraping by. This was a world quietly building towards something. Further east, in the Indus Valley, early farming communities were taking their first steps toward what would eventually become one of the great river civilizations. In China, along the Yellow River and the Yangtze, rice and millet cultivation had already been established for thousands of years. Villages were growing into networks of villages. Pottery styles were becoming more sophisticated, more regionally distinct, suggesting cultures with their own identities, their own traditions, their own stories. In Europe, something remarkable was flourishing in what archaeologists now call Old Europe. Cultures like the Vinca, spread across the Balkans, had developed some of the earliest known writing symbols in human history, centuries before Sumerian cuneiform. They built settlements with populations that some researchers estimate may have reached into the thousands. They created intricate pottery, sophisticated metallurgy, and what appears to be an organized, even egalitarian, social structure. We'll spend more time with them later, because what happened to Old Europe around this same period is another thread in tonight's larger tapestry. Across the Atlantic, in the Americas, human populations were still primarily hunter-gatherers in most regions, but early experiments with plant cultivation were already underway. Squash, in particular, was being grown in parts of Mesoamerica, the seeds of what would eventually become maize agriculture, and eventually the great civilizations of the Maya and the Aztec were quite literally being planted. And in Australia, Aboriginal communities had already been living continuously on the same land for tens of thousands of years, their oral traditions stretching back further than almost any other cultural memory on Earth. Some of their stories, as we'll explore later, seem to describe geological and coastal changes that align, at least loosely, with events from thousands of years earlier. Which raises a fascinating question we'll sit with tonight. How far back can memory actually travel when it's carried carefully enough, generation to generation? So this was the world, scattered but growing, isolated but, in some strange way, moving in parallel directions. Farming was spreading, settlements were expanding. Populations, after the long, hard climb up from near extinction that shaped our species tens of thousands of years earlier, were finally beginning to flourish in relative comfort. And this comfort had a name, or at least climate scientists have given it one. They call it the Holocene climatic optimum, a period of relatively stable, relatively mild conditions that had settled over much of the planet after the last ice age ended. Rainfall was generally reliable. Temperatures were, in many regions, warmer and steadier than what had come before. It was, by the standards of Earth's often turbulent climate history, a remarkably calm stretch of time, the kind of stability that allows civilizations to take root. The kind of stability that lets people plan for next year, and the year after that, and the year after that. It's tempting to imagine it as a kind of golden window, a moment when the planet itself seemed to be cooperating with human ambition. Farming communities didn't need to worry, at least not as much, about the kind of catastrophic climate swings that had haunted their ancestors for hundreds of thousands of years. The world felt, in a sense, safe enough to build on. But here's where our story tonight begins to bend, because sometime around 4200 BC, give or take a century or two depending on which researcher and which data set you consult, something shifted. Not everywhere at once, not in some single dramatic instant that anyone at the time could have pointed to and said, "There, that's the moment everything changed." But gradually, and then perhaps not so gradually, the stable conditions that had allowed all this quiet growth began to unravel. Some researchers call this the 5.9 Kiloyear event, a somewhat clinical name for what may have been one of the more significant climate disruptions of the entire Holocene period. And what's strange, what's genuinely puzzling to those who study it closely, is how widespread its fingerprints seem to be. Not confined to one river valley, one continent, one culture, but scattered across the evidence in Africa, in Asia, in the Middle East, showing up in ice cores drilled from Greenland glaciers, in sediment layers pulled from lake beds on opposite sides of the planet. We'll look closely at that evidence very soon. The ice, the mud, the pollen grains, the isotopes that quietly recorded what was happening to the atmosphere itself. But first it's worth pausing here, in this moment just before the shift, to appreciate what was actually at stake. A world of farming villages, growing settlements, early cooperation on a scale barely imaginable a few thousand years earlier. A world that, without warning, may have been about to change beneath its own feet. So let's talk about that clinical name, the 5.9 Kiloyear event. It sounds like something you'd find in a technical journal, something meant for specialists and not for the rest of us. But hidden inside that sterile label is a story about the planet shifting beneath human feet, and it's worth understanding exactly what it means before we go any further. The word Kiloyear is simply a measurement. 1 Kiloyear equals 1,000 years. So when researchers talk about the 5.9 Kiloyear event, they're referring to a significant climate shift that occurred roughly 5,900 years before the present day, which places it, with some margin for error, right around 3,900 BC on our modern calendars. Close enough to that 4,200 BC timeframe we're exploring tonight that many researchers consider them part of the same broader period of instability, or at least connected chapters in the same long story of climate disruption. Now, if you spent any time reading about ancient climate shifts, you might have come across another event with a similar name. The 4.2 Kiloyear event. This one is far better known, far more widely studied. It happened around 2200 BC, roughly 2,000 years later than the event we're discussing tonight. and it's generally credited with causing the collapse of the Akkadian Empire in Mesopotamia, the decline of the Old Kingdom in Egypt, and significant disruptions across the Indus Valley and parts of China. It's the climate disaster that gets all the attention, the one that shows up in textbooks and documentaries, the heavy hitter of Holocene climate shifts. But here's what makes the 5.9 Kiloyear event so intriguing, and in some ways, so much more mysterious. It happened earlier. It happened during a period when human societies were still in their most fragile, most formative stage, before empires. Before written records, at least as we typically define them. Before the elaborate bureaucratic systems that would later leave us detailed accounts of droughts and famines and kings falling from power. The 4.2 Kiloyear event hit civilizations that were already large, already complex, already capable of documenting their own downfall in clay tablets and stone inscriptions. The 5.9 Kiloyear event hit something smaller, something quieter, something that might not have had the tools to record what was happening to it, but that still felt the impact deeply enough to leave traces in the earth itself. So what does the climate record actually show? Let's start with lake sediments. Lakes are remarkable historians. They sit there year after year, collecting material that falls into them or washes in from surrounding land. Sediment settles in layers, each layer representing a period of time, like pages in a very slow, very patient book. And within those sediments, preserved in the dark, quiet water, are pollen grains. Pollen is extraordinarily durable. Those tiny, nearly invisible structures that plants release into the air each season have outer shells tough enough to survive for thousands, even millions of years buried in mud. And each type of plant produces pollen with a distinctive shape. So when scientists pull core samples from lake beds and examine the pollen trapped in different sediment layers, they can literally read the history of local vegetation. They can see what was growing around that lake 5,000 years ago, 4,000 years ago, 3,000 years ago. They can watch entire ecosystems shift, layer by layer, century by century. What those pollen records show around the time of the 5.9 Kiloyear event is, depending on the region, either quietly unsettling or genuinely dramatic. In parts of Africa, in the Middle East, in sections of southern Asia, the pollen profiles shift with notable speed. Plants that prefer wetter conditions, trees that need reliable rainfall, grasses that thrive in well-watered environments, they begin to disappear from the record. Not vanishing overnight, but declining steadily, sometimes sharply, replaced by species adapted to drier, harsher conditions. Thorny shrubs, desert grasses, plants that can survive with less water, less predictability, less mercy from the sky. This is what scientists call aridification, a transition toward drier conditions. Not necessarily a sudden drought that arrives one summer and leaves the next, but a deeper, more sustained shift in the overall moisture available to a region. Rainfall patterns change, evaporation increases, lakes shrink. Rivers that once flowed year-round become seasonal or stop flowing entirely. The land itself seems to dry out from the inside, as though whatever mechanism had been supplying water to these regions has been quietly dialed down. And aridification, when it arrives in regions where people have been relying on regular rainfall for their crops, for their livestock, for the rivers that sustain their settlements, is not a gentle process. It doesn't announce itself with a dramatic gesture. It just gradually, persistently removes the foundation that everything else has been built on. The evidence from lake sediments isn't limited to pollen. Isotope analysis of the sediment layers themselves can reveal information about water temperature, water levels, even the general humidity of the atmosphere at different points in time. Some of these indicators also show shifts around the 5.9 Kiloyear mark, though the data is more fragmented, more debated, than the relatively clear pollen signal. which brings us to an important point about this event that we should acknowledge honestly. The 5.9 Kiloyear event is not universally accepted among climate scientists in the same way that the 4.2 Kiloyear event is. Some researchers argue that the evidence, while suggestive, is not sufficiently consistent across enough sites to qualify as a truly global climate event. They point out that different regions show different timing, different severity, different patterns of change. Some lake records show clear shifts around 3900 BC. Others show changes that might fit the pattern, but could also be explained by local factors rather than a planet-wide disruption. Still others show nothing particularly unusual at that timestamp at all. It's a legitimate debate, science, especially paleoclimatology. The study of ancient climates rarely offers the kind of clean, unambiguous answers we might wish for. The past doesn't always leave neat signatures. It leaves hints, fragments, sometimes contradictory traces that different researchers interpret in different ways. And the 5.9 Kiloyear event sits squarely in that territory where reasonable people can disagree about exactly what happened, exactly how significant it was, and exactly how widely its effects were felt. What most researchers do agree on, however, even those who are cautious about calling it a formal global event, is that something was happening to the climate around this time, that multiple regions across Africa, the Middle East, and parts of Asia experienced noticeable aridification during this general period, that the relatively stable, relatively mild conditions of the early Holocene were giving way to something less predictable, less generous. Whether that something qualifies as a single synchronized planetary shift or a more patchwork collection of regional changes that happened roughly around the same time, that remains an open question. But here's what makes it worth sitting with tonight, worth carrying with us as we move forward into the evidence and the stories and the traditions that follow. Even if the 5.9 Kiloyear event wasn't a single dramatic planetary catastrophe, even if it was messier and more uneven than that, it was still a shift that coincides with something noticeable in the archaeological and cultural record. Settlements that had been thriving began to struggle or disappear. Populations that had been growing began to plateau or decline. And perhaps most tellingly, across multiple continents, multiple traditions, multiple languages separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years, people seem to have remembered this period, or something very like it, as a time when the world changed. Whether that memory was accurate, whether it was exaggeration, whether it was myth layered over reality or reality preserved within myth, we'll explore those questions as we go. But the climate record, even in its uncertainty, gives us something concrete to stand on. The Earth itself recorded a shift. The mud and the pollen and the isotopes bear witness to something that made the world drier, harder, less forgiving than it had been before. If lake sediments and their tiny preserved pollen grains give us one window into this period of shifting climate, the ice cores of Greenland and Antarctica offer us another. And what they reveal is, in its own quiet way, just as remarkable. Ice cores are strange and beautiful things. They are cylinders of ancient ice, drilled from the deepest layers of glaciers and ice sheets, pulled up from depths where the snow fell thousands, even tens of thousands of years ago, and never melted. Each layer of ice represents a single year, or sometimes a single season of snowfall. And just as sediment settles in lake beds, creating a slow vertical timeline, snow accumulates on these massive ice sheets, compressing under its own weight, trapping within its frozen structure whatever was in the air and the water at the moment it fell. This means that ice cores are, in a very literal sense, time capsules of the atmosphere. They capture tiny bubbles of ancient air, sealed within the ice, preserving the exact composition of the atmosphere at the moment that snow drifted down from the sky. They also capture isotopes, variations in the molecular structure of the water itself, which can tell researchers about the temperature at the time the snow formed. Oxygen isotopes, particularly the ratio between oxygen-16 and oxygen-18, act as a kind of natural thermometer. When global temperatures are warmer, more of the heavier oxygen-18 isotope makes it into the precipitation that falls on these ice sheets. When temperatures drop, the lighter oxygen-16 becomes more dominant. By measuring these ratios layer by layer, scientists can reconstruct a remarkably detailed history of temperature fluctuations stretching back hundreds of thousands of years. So what do the ice cores tell us about the period around 4,200 to 3,900 BC? The signals here are more subtle than the dramatic temperature swings we see during the transitions into and out of full ice ages. This wasn't a moment when glaciers were advancing across continents or retreating in massive pulses. But the isotopic records from both Greenland and Antarctica do show evidence of a shift during this general time frame. A noticeable change in temperature patterns, a departure from the relatively stable warmth that had characterized the early Holocene, that long mild period we explored earlier when the world was, in many places, unusually generous to human settlement. Some researchers interpret this shift as evidence of cooling in the higher latitudes, a dip in global temperatures that may have been connected to changes in ocean circulation or atmospheric patterns. Others see it as part of a longer, more gradual trend toward the climate variability that would eventually define the middle and late Holocene. The details are debated. The exact timing varies between different ice core records. But the general direction of change, a move away from stability toward something more erratic, more unsettled, is present in the data. And here is where the story starts to connect across different types of evidence. Because the temperature shifts recorded in the ice cores appear to line up, at least broadly, with the aridification patterns visible in the lake sediments. When temperatures in the higher latitudes change, when ocean circulation shifts, when atmospheric patterns reorganize themselves, the consequences don't stay confined to the poles. They ripple outward, affecting rainfall patterns thousands of miles away, altering the behavior of monsoon systems that deliver water to vast regions of Africa and Asia, changing the balance of moisture that determines whether a landscape remains a lush savanna or becomes a parched desert. The monsoon connection is particularly important for understanding what might have been happening during this period. Monsoons are massive seasonal wind patterns driven by temperature differences between land masses and oceans. When the timing, intensity, or reach of monsoon circulation changes, the effects can be devastating for populations that rely on those predictable rains. And several independent data sets, including marine sediment records from the Atlantic and Indian Oceans, alongside the lake sediment and ice core evidence, suggest that monsoon patterns were indeed weakening or shifting around the time of the 5.9 Kiloyear event. Marine sediments work in much the same way as lake sediments and ice cores. Material settles to the ocean floor over time, layer by layer, preserving within those layers tiny fragments of whatever was happening in the water above and the land nearby. Dust blown from distant continents, microorganisms whose remains reflect ocean temperature and chemistry. Organic compounds that carry signatures of rainfall and vegetation on the coasts. When scientists analyze marine sediment cores from regions influenced by monsoon-driven upwelling and rainfall, they find evidence that the strength of monsoon circulation declined during this period, less moisture reaching the interiors of continents, more dust being blown offshore from regions that were drying out, a coherent pattern of environmental stress that echoes what we see in the lakes and what we see in the ice. Now, here is something that deserves our careful attention. When multiple independent data sets drawn from different materials, different regions, different methods of analysis, all point toward the same general time frame and the same general pattern of change, it becomes harder to dismiss the signal as coincidence or local variation. ice cores from the poles, lake sediments from the tropics and subtropics, marine sediments from the ocean basins, pollen records from continental interiors, isotopic indicators from all of these sources and more. None of these datasets are perfect. None of them tell the complete story on their own, but together they form a kind of convergent testimony, different witnesses speaking in different languages, describing something that happened at roughly the same moment in planetary history. This convergence is what gives researchers confidence that something real occurred during this period. Not just a local drought or a regional fluctuation, but a broader reorganization of the climate system that left fingerprints in multiple places, multiple archives, multiple types of evidence. That said, it's worth pausing here to acknowledge something important about how this kind of science works, and where its limitations lie. Correlation across multiple datasets is compelling, but it is not the same thing as proven causation. The fact that ice cores show a temperature shift around the same time that lake sediments show aridification and marine sediments show monsoon weakening does not, on its own, prove that all of these changes were caused by a single unified event. It's possible that some of these shifts were connected through common mechanisms, changes in ocean circulation triggering both high-latitude cooling and tropical drying, for instance. It's also possible that some of them were independent responses to different forcing factors that simply happened to overlap in time. Climate systems are extraordinarily complex, with feedback loops and regional variations that can make it difficult to trace a straight line from cause to effect. Paleoclimate researchers are generally careful about this distinction. They talk about synchronous changes and convergent evidence rather than claiming to have identified a single global catastrophe with a single cause. The data tells us that something happened. The data tells us that it happened roughly around the same time in multiple places. The data does not, with the same level of certainty, tell us exactly why it happened, or whether every regional change we observe was directly connected to every other. This caution is worth keeping in mind as we move deeper into the evidence and into the cultural traditions that seem to echo it. The temptation to construct a dramatic narrative, a single cataclysm that reset human civilization across every continent simultaneously, is understandable. It makes for a compelling story. But the climate record, while suggestive and while genuinely intriguing, does not quite give us that kind of clean dramatic simplicity. What it gives us instead is something more fragmented, more uneven, but still in its own way, deeply significant. A pattern of disruption, a convergence of stress signals, a time when the world, in multiple places and multiple ways, became harder to live in than it had been before. And for the people who were alive during that time, who were trying to farm, to herd, to build, to raise children in landscapes that were slowly drying out around them, the academic distinction between a single global event and a patchwork of overlapping regional shifts probably didn't matter much. What mattered was that the rains were failing, the rivers were shrinking, the world they had known was changing, and they had to figure out how to survive in the new one that was emerging. Whether they succeeded, and what they remembered about the experience, is where the human side of this story truly begins. Nowhere is the human experience of that environmental shift more vivid, more staggering, than in what happened to the Sahara. Because before this period, before the changes we've been tracing through ice cores and lake sediments and marine records, the Sahara was not the desert we know today. It was something else entirely, something that seems almost impossible to reconcile with the endless sand and scorched rock that defines the region now. For thousands of years during that long mild stretch of the early Holocene, the Sahara was green. Not just patchy green, not just a few scattered oases, but genuinely remarkably green. Lakes filled basins that are now dry dust bowls. Rivers flowed across landscapes that haven't seen running water in millennia. Savannas and grasslands stretched across vast expanses, supporting herds of animals that we associate with regions far to the south. Elephants, giraffes, hippopotamuses, crocodiles, all of them living in what is now some of the most inhospitable terrain on Earth. And people lived there too, not just survived, but lived. Flourished even. The evidence for this is written in stone, literally, across thousands of sites throughout the Sahara. Rock art, paintings and engravings carved into cliff faces and boulders, depicting a world that bears no resemblance to the empty desert that surrounds them today. Some of these images are extraordinary in their detail and their beauty. They show cattle with curved horns, sometimes decorated with ornate patterns, suggesting not just wild animals but herded, domesticated livestock. They show people fishing in lakes, paddling boats across waters that no longer exist. They show dancing figures, ritual scenes, daily life conducted in landscapes of abundant water and shade. The most famous of these rock art traditions comes from the Tassili Niger Plateau in what is now Algeria. But similar imagery appears across the Sahara, from Mauritania to Libya, from Niger to Egypt. The style of the art changes over time, and researchers have used these changes to reconstruct a kind of visual timeline of the Sahara's transformation. The earliest images depict large wild animals, elephants and hippos and giraffes, in landscapes that were still heavily watered. Later images show cattle and herding scenes, reflecting the period when human populations had developed pastoral lifestyles, moving their herds between grazing lands as the seasonal patterns allowed. And then, still later, the art shifts again. The cattle disappear. The lush landscapes vanish. Instead, we see images of horses, and eventually camels, animals adapted to aridity, to the world the Sahara was becoming. It's a visual record of ecological collapse, painted by the people who were experiencing it in real time. How this green world came to exist in the first place is a story that connects back to those monsoon patterns we explored earlier. During the early Holocene, the African monsoon reached much farther north than it does today, carrying moisture deep into the interior of the continent. The Sahara received enough rainfall to sustain rivers, lakes, grasslands, and the complex ecosystems that depended on them. Lake Mega-Chad, for instance, was a vast inland sea that at its maximum extent covered an area larger than the Caspian Sea today. The Nile, too, was a different river during this period, swelling with waters that came not just from its Ethiopian highland source, but from tributaries within the Sahara itself that no longer flow. But monsoon systems are sensitive things. They respond to changes in temperature, in ocean circulation, in the position of atmospheric pressure belts. And as the climate patterns of the early Holocene began to shift, as the ice cores and marine sediments suggest they did around the time of the 5.9 Kiloyear event, the African monsoon retreated. It pulled southward, step by step, year by year, leaving behind landscapes that had depended on its rains for their very existence. The desertification of the Sahara was not a single dramatic event, a day when the rains simply stopped forever. It was a process, a gradual but relentless drying, that unfolded over centuries, probably punctuated by particularly severe droughts that accelerated the transition. Some researchers believe that the shift happened with surprising speed, what climatologists call a threshold response, where an ecosystem can absorb gradual changes for a long time, and then suddenly, catastrophically, flip into a new state once a critical point is crossed. It's possible that the Sahara's green period was always precarious, always dependent on a delicate balance of moisture and vegetation, and that once that balance was disrupted, once the vegetation cover began to thin and the soils began to lose their capacity to retain water, the whole system collapsed with a speed that seems almost impossible. This kind of threshold behavior is something we see in other climate systems as well. Self-reinforcing feedback loops, where a small change triggers larger changes that amplify the original shift. Less rainfall means less vegetation. Less vegetation means less moisture retained in the soil and less transpiration returning water to the atmosphere. Less moisture in the local atmosphere means less local rainfall. And so the cycle accelerates, each step making the next step more likely, until you've crossed from savanna to desert faster than any gradual timeline would predict. However fast or slow the transition was, the consequences for the human populations living in the Sahara were profound. The rock art tells us that people had built lives, cultures, entire ways of being in this green world. They had herding traditions, social structures, ritual practices, all shaped by and dependent on a landscape of water and grass. When that landscape began to vanish, they faced a choice that must have been agonizing. Stay and try to adapt to a world that was becoming increasingly impossible, or leave and seek somewhere else where the old ways or new ways might still sustain them. Many of them left, and where they went would shape the course of human history. Because as the Sahara dried, as its lakes shrank, and its rivers stopped flowing, and its grasslands turned to dust, the populations that had lived there were pushed toward the places where water still existed. The Nile Valley, the Mesopotamian floodplains, the oases and highlands that could still support life. These refuges became gathering points, places where displaced populations converged, bringing with them their knowledge, their traditions, their cultural practices, their accumulated experience of living in a world that was changing beyond their control. The connection between the Sahara's desertification and the rise of early river valley civilizations is one of those patterns that historians and archaeologists have debated for generations. It's not a simple or direct causal link, the kind where you can say the Sahara dried and therefore Egypt was born. But it's possible. Some researchers believe that the concentration of populations along the Nile and in Mesopotamia during this period was at least partly driven by the environmental pressures that were pushing people out of the drying landscapes they had previously inhabited. More people in a smaller area means more need for organization, for coordination, for systems that can manage resources and resolve conflicts and distribute labor. It means the conditions under which something like civilization, something like centralized states, something like large-scale agriculture, becomes not just possible but necessary. Whether this is the right interpretation or not, the timing is striking. The Sahara's green period ends around the same time that we see the first significant settlements and social complexification emerging along the Nile and in Mesopotamia. The environmental stress and the cultural development occur in the same broad window. Coincidence, or cause and effect, or something in between. A relationship where environmental pressure creates conditions that make certain developments more likely without strictly determining them. It remains debated. What we can say with more confidence is that the Sahara's transformation was one of the most dramatic landscape changes in human memory, and that the people who experienced it, who watched their world dry up around them, who painted cattle on rock faces in places where cattle would never graze again, carried that experience with them wherever they went next. It became part of their story, part of their understanding of what the world could do, how suddenly and completely things could change, and perhaps part of the traditions they passed down to their descendants. Traditions that might eventually take the form of stories about a time of abundance, followed by a time of devastating loss. And as those displaced populations converged on the remaining refuges, on places where water still flowed and soil still yielded grain, they carried something else with them besides their herds and their tools. They carried memory of a world that had been generous, and then, without warning, had turned hostile. Memory of rains that stopped coming, of rivers that shrank to trickles, of landscapes that had sustained their ancestors for generations suddenly becoming uninhabitable. And in at least one of those gathering places in the flat alluvial plains between the Tigris and the Euphrates, that memory was eventually written down. We call it the Iridu-Genesis. It is the oldest known flood narrative in human history, composed in Sumerian, the language of the world's first literate civilization, somewhere around the early 2nd millennium BCE. But the story it tells is far older than the clay tablets on which it was inscribed, far older than cuneiform script, far older, possibly, than Sumer itself. The Iridu-Genesis describes a world that has existed for a long time, a world of cities and kings, of agriculture and religious practice, a world that looks in many ways remarkably like the one the Sumerians themselves inhabited. And then that world ends. The gods, for reasons that remain fragmentary in the surviving text, decide to destroy humanity with a great flood. But one man is warned, Ziusudra, a king, a righteous ruler, who receives instruction from a divine being to build a boat, to gather life inside it, to prepare for the deluge that will wipe everything else away. The flood comes. It rages across the land for 7 days and 7 nights. And then it recedes. Ziusudra opens the hatch of his boat, steps out into a world that has been scrubbed clean, and offers sacrifice to the gods, who are surprised and apparently somewhat conflicted about the fact that anyone survived at all. He is then granted eternal life, transported to a distant land where he lives forever, a bridge between the world that was destroyed and the world that would be rebuilt. If parts of this story sound familiar, they should. The Iridu-Genesis predates and parallels the far more famous flood narrative found in the Epic of Gilgamesh, that sprawling masterpiece of Akkadian literature in which the hero Gilgamesh seeks out Utnapishtim, the sole survivor of a great deluge, to learn the secret of immortality. Utnapishtim's account of the flood, embedded within the larger epic, follows essentially the same structure as the Ziusudra story: divine warning, boat construction, catastrophic flooding, survival, sacrifice, immortality. The details differ, the names change, the theological context shifts as the story moves from Sumerian to Akkadian cultural frameworks, but the core architecture of the narrative remains recognizably the same. And both of these Mesopotamian accounts, in turn, share structural parallels with flood traditions found in Genesis, in the Matsya Purana, in Chinese legend, in stories told across continents and millennia, that we will explore in the sections ahead. Whether these parallels reflect independent memories of similar events, cultural diffusion across trade networks and conquest routes, or something more complicated, some deep shared inheritance from a period when human populations were still closely connected, remains debated. But what gives the Mesopotamian flood tradition a particular kind of weight, a particular claim on our attention, is that it emerges from a landscape where archaeologists have found something tangible, physical evidence, layered in the soil beneath the ancient city of Sir Leonard Woolley uncovered a distinct stratum of water-laid sediment, a band of clean clay, approximately 3 meters thick, separating the earlier settlement layers from the later ones. A flood layer, physical proof that at some point in the distant past a significant inundation had washed over this site, depositing a blanket of silt that buried whatever had been there before. Similar deposits have been identified at other Mesopotamian sites, including Shuruppak, the city associated in the literary tradition with Ziusudra himself. The coincidence is striking. The story names a specific city. The soil beneath that city contains evidence of a significant flood. It's tempting to see a direct connection to say that the Sumerian flood narrative is simply the literary memory of a real event, preserved in the archaeological record. But the scholarly debate over this interpretation is considerable. The flood layers at and Shuruppak, while undeniable, do not all date to the same period. They appear at different depths in different locations, suggesting that they may record separate, local inundations rather than a single catastrophic event that covered the entire region. Mesopotamia is, after all, a floodplain. The Tigris and Euphrates overflow regularly. Devastating floods are a recurring feature of life in this landscape, not a singular anomaly. Some researchers believe that the literary tradition may represent a conflation of multiple flood experiences, individual disasters that were remembered and retold and gradually amplified into a single great deluge, a universal destruction, a story powerful enough to stand as a metaphor for the fragility of human achievement in a world where the water can rise without warning and wash away everything you have built. Others suggest that a particularly severe flood during the period of transition we have been tracing, perhaps one that coincided with the broader climatic shifts of the late 4th millennium BCE, could have served as the seed from which the narrative grew, a real disaster enlarged by generations of retelling into something mythic. What is clear, regardless of which interpretation holds, is that the Sumerian Flood Tablets preserve a memory of environmental catastrophe, a memory of a world destroyed by water, a memory that resonates in ways we are still trying to understand, with traditions preserved by cultures far beyond Mesopotamia's reach. There is another document from ancient Mesopotamia that captures this sense of a world divided, a reality split in two by something so profound that the scribes who recorded it treated it as the most fundamental boundary in all of human history. It is called the Sumerian King List, and it is, on its surface, a straightforward administrative record. A list of rulers, the cities where they reigned, and the lengths of their sovereignty. A bureaucratic document, the kind of thing you might expect from a civilization obsessed with record-keeping and the maintenance of order. But when you actually read it, when you pay attention to what it is saying rather than simply what it is cataloguing, you realize that it is something far stranger than a mere ledger of political succession. It is a map of a broken timeline. The structure of the King List is deceptively simple. It begins as so many ancient texts do, with a statement of origins. When kingship was lowered from heaven, the text announces, the kingship was in Eridu. And then it proceeds to catalogue the rulers of that first city, and then the rulers of the next city where kingship was transferred, and then the next, tracing the movement of royal authority across the Sumerian landscape from dynasty to dynasty, from age to age. But the numbers it gives for these early reigns are not normal numbers. They are not the lengths of human lives that any of us would recognize. Alulim, the first king of Eridu, reigned for 28,800 years. Alalga reigned for 36,000 years. Enmenluana reigned for 43,200 years. And so it continues through a catalogue of 8 antediluvian kings, 5 cities, and a total reign length that adds up to 241,200 years. Over 200 millennia of continuous kingship before the flood. Now, it is possible to read these numbers as simple exaggeration, as the kind of mythological inflation that occurs when later generations try to project their own political legitimacy back into a distant, unverifiable past. Some researchers believe that these enormous reign lengths represent symbolic rather than literal timekeeping, that they function as a way of expressing the authority and prestige of early dynasties rather than recording actual historical durations. There is a logic to this interpretation. No human being lives for 28,800 years. No dynasty maintains continuous rule for over 200 millennia. The numbers must mean something other than what they appear to say on the surface. Perhaps they encode cycles of astronomical observation, or represent the collective duration of entire ruling lineages, compressed into the figure of a single legendary founder. The debate over their precise significance remains ongoing, and the arguments are intricate and far from settled. But what is striking about the King List, what makes it relevant to the investigation we are pursuing here, is not the specific numbers themselves, but the way the document treats the transition between the world that came before and the world that came after. Because the King List does not present the flood as just one event in a continuous sequence. It presents it as a rupture, a discontinuity so fundamental that everything before it belongs to a different category of reality than everything after it. The text states with a kind of administrative brevity that makes its implications all the more startling that after the flood had swept over, and when kingship was again lowered from heaven, kingship was in Kish. The flood had swept over. That is the boundary. That is the moment that divides the entire history of human governance into two distinct epochs, and the change in the record is immediate and dramatic. The first king of Kish after the flood, a ruler named Etana, reigned for 1,500 years, still a long reign by modern standards, but a fraction of the lengths attributed to the antediluvian rulers, and from there the numbers decline rapidly. The next king reigned for 400 years, then 300, then 6, then 5. Within a few generations, the reign lengths have settled into durations that look recognizably human, decades rather than centuries, lifetimes rather than epochs. The ancient scribes who composed and maintained the king list were not naive. They were working within a literary and cultural tradition that understood the difference between the age of myth and the age of documented history. And yet they preserved this structure. They maintained the dramatic contrast between the world before the flood and the world after it. They treated the flood as a dividing line so significant that it warranted a complete transformation in the way time itself was recorded and understood. Whether they believed literally in kings who reigned for tens of thousands of years, or whether those figures served some other symbolic purpose, the fact remains that they chose to present human history as fundamentally bifurcated, a before and an after, a golden age of impossible longevity, and a diminished present in which human lifespans had been reduced to something far more modest and fragile. This internal structure, this sense of a world that was somehow different before the waters came, mirrors something we will encounter repeatedly as we move through the traditions of other continents. The Egyptian concept of Zep Tepi, the first time, describes a primordial age of divine rulership that preceded the historical era of mortal pharaohs. The Hindu tradition preserves accounts of earlier yugas, vast cosmic ages in which human capacities were greater and lifespans were longer. Genesis records not only the flood itself, but a genealogical catalogue in which the ages of the patriarchs decline steadily from Adam's 930 years to figures that look, by the time of Abraham, like ordinary human lifespans. The pattern repeats, a before, an after, a transition marked by water, by catastrophe, by something that reduced human scale and transformed the conditions of existence. Whether the Sumerian king list is preserving a literal memory of a pre-flood civilization that was disrupted by the climatic shifts of the late 4th millennium BCE, or whether it is encoding a more symbolic understanding of what it means to live in a world that has been fundamentally altered by environmental catastrophe, the document itself stands as evidence that ancient Mesopotamian culture remembered a transition, a boundary, a moment when the rules changed, and that memory, preserved in clay and transmitted through generations of scribes, is a thread that connects this one river valley to a much larger pattern of human remembrance, a pattern that extends far beyond the plains, between the Tigris and the Euphrates, out across the deserts, the mountains and the oceans, to cultures that had no direct contact with Sumer and no knowledge of its administrative records, but which nevertheless preserved their own accounts of a world that ended, and a world that began again. Move southwest from Mesopotamia, across the deserts that today separate Iraq from Egypt, and you find another culture that preserved its own version of this boundary, its own memory of a before and an after. But where the Sumerian scribes recorded their transition in clay tablets and administrative lists, the Egyptians encoded theirs in the very structure of their cosmology, in a concept so fundamental to their understanding of reality that it shaped every temple, every ritual, every royal inscription they ever produced. They called it Zep Tepi, the first time. Zep Tepi is not simply a date on an ancient calendar. It is not a historical epoch in the way we might think of the Renaissance or the Classical Age. It is something stranger, something more foundational. In Egyptian thought, Zep Tepi represents the moment of original creation, the instant when the primordial waters of Nun receded and the first mound of earth emerged from the infinite deep. It is the time when order was established out of chaos, when the principles of Ma'at, of balance, harmony and justice, were first woven into the fabric of reality. But crucially, Zep Tepi is also described as an age, a period of divine rulership, when the gods themselves walked the earth and governed humanity directly. The Egyptian texts describe this primeval era with a specificity that goes beyond mere mythological flourish. Ra, the sun god, ruled from his throne in the heavens. Shu and Tefnut, the gods of air and moisture, maintained the cosmic atmosphere. Geb and Nut, earth and sky, were still joined together before they were forcibly separated. And Osiris, the lord of the underworld, sat upon the throne of Egypt itself, establishing a kingdom of abundance and peace that would serve as the template for all mortal governance that followed. This was the Golden Age, the time before time, an era when the land was fertile beyond anything later generations would experience, when the Nile flowed in perfect rhythm, when human beings lived in direct communion with the divine forces that sustained the world. Then came the disruption. The texts describe a fall, a deterioration, a transition from divine governance to mortal rule. The gods withdrew. They ascended to the heavens, or descended into the underworld, leaving the administration of the world to human pharaohs who could only approximate the perfection of Zep Tepi rather than embody it fully. The first mortal king, Menes, unified the two lands of Upper and Lower Egypt and established the first dynasty. But his reign and the reigns of all subsequent pharaohs were understood not as the continuation of Zep Tepi, but as its echo, its reflection, an ongoing attempt to recapture a perfection that had been lost. This conceptual framework, this insistence that the historical present is merely a diminished shadow of an earlier, more ordered reality, mirrors the structure we found in the Sumerian king list. Both traditions preserve the memory of a transition from an age of greater possibility to an age of limitation. Both treat that transition as the defining event in human history. Both encode it not as a gradual evolution, but as a rupture, a sudden change in the conditions of existence. And in the Egyptian case, that rupture is intimately connected to the behavior of the Nile. Egyptian civilization was shaped by the annual flooding of the Nile more profoundly than perhaps any other culture has been shaped by a single environmental phenomenon. The flood determined the agricultural calendar. It structured the ritual year. It defined the relationship between order and chaos, abundance and scarcity, life and death. Every summer the waters rose and inundated the valley, depositing fertile silt across the floodplain and making agriculture possible in the midst of an otherwise barren desert. Every autumn the waters receded, leaving behind the renewed soil that would sustain the population for another year. This cycle of inundation and emergence was not just an agricultural reality. It was a cosmological one. The Egyptians understood their own existence as a continuous reenactment of Zep Tepi. Each flood was a return to the primordial waters of Nun. Each recession was a re-emergence of the first mound, a restoration of order from chaos. The rhythm of the river was the rhythm of creation itself. But what happens when that rhythm is disrupted? What happens when the floods fail, or when they come too early or too late, or with destructive force rather than nurturing moderation? Paleoclimate research suggests that the Nile Valley experienced significant hydrological fluctuations during the late 4th millennium BCE, the same period when the broader climatic shift we have been tracing was reshaping landscapes across Africa and Asia. Some researchers believe that these fluctuations may have contributed to the political unification of Egypt, as scattered populations along the valley were forced to consolidate under central authority in order to manage increasingly unpredictable water resources. Others suggest that the memory of a time when the Nile was more reliable, when the floods came with greater consistency and agricultural abundance was easier to achieve, might have been encoded into the cultural tradition of Zep Tepi, not as a literal record of pre-dynastic conditions, but as a mythological reflection of an environmental reality that had been lost. It is important to be cautious here. The temptation to read Zep Tepi as a direct account of pre-4200 BCE conditions is strong, and some researchers have embraced it with enthusiasm, arguing that the Egyptian tradition preserves genuine historical memories of a sophisticated civilization that existed before the pharaonic state and was disrupted by the same climatic catastrophe that reshaped Mesopotamia. These interpretations often point to the unusual astronomical alignments of certain early Egyptian monuments, or to the technical sophistication of Old Kingdom architecture, as evidence that the Egyptians inherited knowledge from an earlier forgotten culture. The arguments are intricate and sometimes compelling, but they remain speculative. There is no direct archaeological evidence of a pre-dynastic Egyptian civilization that surpassed the achievements of the early pharaohs. The pre-dynastic cultures of the Nile Valley were sophisticated and complex, but they were not the divine kingdom described in the Zep Tepi texts. What we can say with more confidence is that the Egyptian conceptual framework, like the Sumerian one, preserves the memory of a transition, a boundary between an earlier state of greater order and abundance and a later state of diminished possibility, and that this memory, whether it reflects actual environmental changes in the Nile Valley or simply encodes a universal human experience of loss and imperfection, fits within the broader pattern we are tracing across every continent, a before and after, a transformation attributed to forces beyond human control, forces that reshaped the conditions of life and required a complete reconceptualization of what it meant to exist in the world. Move northwest from the Nile Valley, across the Mediterranean and along the coastlines of the Levant, and you encounter the tradition that would ultimately become the most widely known flood narrative in human history. The story preserved in the Hebrew Bible in the book of Genesis, the account of Noah and the great deluge that destroyed all living things from the face of the earth. The structure of the Genesis flood narrative is familiar to billions of people, but its architectural details are worth examining closely because they reveal a text that is doing something far more complex than simply recording a supernatural disaster. The story begins with a divine observation. Humanity has become corrupt. The earth is filled with violence. The Creator looks upon the world and sees that every inclination of the human heart is only evil continually. This is not a random catastrophe. This is a deliberate reset, a cosmic response to systemic failure. The decision to destroy is framed as a judicial act, a sweeping away of a corrupted order so that something new can begin. Then comes the instruction. Noah, a righteous man, is told to build an ark. The specifications are exact: the length, the breadth, the height, the materials gopher wood sealed inside and out with pitch. The design includes a roof, a door, and 3 decks. It is an engineered vessel, not a drifting raft, and the instructions extend beyond construction. Noah is told to gather every kind of animal, male and female, to keep them alive. Food must be stored. Provision must be made for every living creature that will ride out the storm. The preparation is methodical, almost bureaucratic in its attention to categorization and survival logistics. The flood itself arrives with devastating completeness. The text describes the fountains of the great deep bursting open and the windows of the heavens being opened. Water comes from below and from above. Every living thing that moves on the earth perishes. Birds, livestock, wild animals, all swarming creatures, and every human being outside the ark. The language is relentless. The destruction is total. For 150 days the waters prevail over the earth. The world is returned to a state of formless void, echoing the very beginning of Genesis itself, the primordial chaos before creation. Then the waters recede. The ark comes to rest on the mountains of Ararat. Noah sends out a raven, then a dove. The dove returns with an olive leaf, then does not return at all. The earth is dry. The survivors emerge. And what follows is not simply a return to normal existence. It is a new creation. The divine voice establishes a covenant. Never again will all life be cut off by the waters of a flood. The rainbow becomes the sign of this promise, a permanent reminder that the reset has occurred and that the conditions of existence have been fundamentally altered. The old world is gone. A new order has been established, with new rules, new boundaries, and a new relationship between the creator and creation. But here is where the story becomes truly intriguing from a historical perspective. Because the Genesis flood narrative is not an isolated composition, it exists within a literary ecosystem that includes much older Mesopotamian texts we have already touched on in our examination of the Sumerian tablets. The parallels between the biblical account and the earlier Akkadian and Sumerian flood stories are extensive and specific. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the hero Utnapishtim is warned by the god Ea that a great flood is coming. He is instructed to build a boat with precise dimensions and specific materials. He gathers animals and provisions. The flood destroys all life outside the vessel. The boat comes to rest on a mountain. He sends out birds to test whether the land has dried. He offers a sacrifice upon emerging, and the gods establish a covenant of sorts, granting him immortality as the sole survivor of the cataclysm. The structural similarities are undeniable. The sequence of events, from divine warning to vessel construction, to total destruction, to mountain landing, to bird dispatch to new covenant, follows the same narrative arc in both traditions. This raises a question that has occupied scholars for generations. Are these stories descended from a single original account that was passed down through different cultures and adapted to different theological frameworks? Or did they develop independently, each culture encoding its own experience of catastrophic flooding into a similar narrative template? Some researchers believe the answer is clearly the former. The Mesopotamian flood stories predate the biblical text by centuries, possibly millennia. The Hebrew Bible as we know it was compiled during the Babylonian exile and the subsequent Persian period, a time when Judean scribes would have had direct exposure to Mesopotamian literary traditions. It is plausible, perhaps even probable, that the Genesis narrative was shaped by acquaintance with these older accounts, reworked to fit the theological demands of monotheism and the covenantal structure of Israelite religion. The God who sends the flood becomes not a capricious member of a divine pantheon acting on impulse, but a single sovereign moral authority executing a considered judgment. The survivor becomes not a fortunate individual granted eternal life as a special privilege, but a righteous patriarch who begins a new chapter in the ongoing story of a chosen people. Other scholars caution against assuming too simple a relationship. They point out that flood narratives exist in cultures that had no possible contact with Mesopotamia, traditions in India, China, Mesoamerica, and across the Pacific that we will explore in the coming sections. If the basic template of divine warning, catastrophic inundation, and survival through vessel or mountain refuge appears in traditions separated by vast distances and thousands of years, perhaps some element of the structure reflects a universal human experience rather than a specific literary borrowing. Perhaps communities across the globe encountered actual floods of devastating magnitude and independently encoded those encounters into narratives that followed similar logic because the underlying event followed similar physics. In Abrahamic tradition, the flood of Noah functions as the ultimate reset. It is the mechanism by which a corrupted creation is wiped clean and started again. The symbolic weight of this narrative has carried through thousands of years of theological interpretation. The flood represents the boundary between a world that had gone wrong and a world that could begin again. It establishes a pattern that echoes through later scriptural accounts of exile and return, of destruction and renewal. The idea that human civilization can reach a point of such systemic failure that only a total clearing of the slate can restore the possibility of right relationship and right order. When we turn to scholarly perspectives on dating and historicity, the terrain becomes more cautious. There is no geological evidence of a global flood that covered the entire Earth to the height of the highest mountains. The biblical chronology, which places the flood at specific dates in antiquity, does not align with any single event in the archaeological or paleoclimate record that could account for such universal destruction. But some researchers have suggested that the narrative may encode memories of more localized but still catastrophic flooding events, perhaps the breaching of natural dams, the sudden inundation of populated lowlands, or the rapid rise of sea levels at the end of the last ice age. The kind of regional disasters that would have seemed, to the communities experiencing them, like the end of the entire world. What remains consistent across all interpretations is the narrative function. The flood of Noah, like the flood of Utnapishtim, like the transitions encoded in the Sumerian king list and the Egyptian Zep Tepi, marks a boundary. A before and an after. A moment when the conditions of human existence were fundamentally transformed by forces beyond human control. And as we continue our journey across the continents, we will find that this boundary, this memory of a transformative inundation, appears in traditions that could not have borrowed it from Mesopotamia or from Genesis. It appears in the stories of cultures that had no contact with the Abrahamic world, that had never heard of Noah or the Ark or the Covenant of the Rainbow. It appears with startling regularity on every continent we examine. Travel east now, beyond the deserts and high mountains that separate Mesopotamia from the subcontinent, and you encounter another tradition where the memory of a great deluge runs deep. In the vast and intricate mythological landscape of Hinduism, the flood narrative does not stand as an isolated episode. It is woven directly into the fabric of cosmic time itself, embedded in the grand cycles of creation and dissolution that govern the entire universe. The story centers on a figure named Manu, not a patriarch in the biblical sense, but something more fundamental. In Hindu cosmology, Manu is the progenitor of humanity, the first man, the archetype from whom all human generations descend. Each cosmic age has its own Manu, and the Manu who survives the Great Flood is known as Shraddhadeva Manu, the Manu of devotion and righteousness. His story is preserved most fully in the Matsya Purana, one of the 18 major Puranic texts that encode the mythological history and cosmological principles of the Hindu tradition. The narrative begins not with a divine judgment against human corruption, but with an act of unexpected compassion. One morning, as Manu performs his ritual ablutions in a river, a tiny fish swims into his hands. The fish speaks to him, asking for protection from the larger creatures that would devour it. Manu places the fish in a jar, but the fish grows rapidly, too large for the jar, then too large for a tank, then too large for a lake, then too large for any body of water on earth. Finally, Manu places the fish in the ocean itself. At this point, the fish reveals its true identity. It is Matsya, the fish avatar of Vishnu, the cosmic preserver, who maintains the order of the universe across endless cycles of creation and destruction. Matsya delivers a warning. A great flood is coming. Not a localized disaster, but a cosmic inundation that will dissolve the entire world, sweeping away all living creatures, all civilizations, all traces of the current order. The universe will be returned to a primordial state of watery chaos, the same condition from which it emerged at the beginning of this cosmic age. But Manu is to survive. He is instructed to build a boat, and to gather upon it the seeds of all plants, the sages who carry the sacred knowledge, and the 7 rishis, the visionary seers who preserve the wisdom of the ages. When the flood arrives, Matsya will guide the boat through the deluge, towing it with a massive rope attached to its horn, navigating the vessel across the endless waters until the world is ready to be reborn. The parallels with the Mesopotamian and biblical narratives are immediately apparent, and scholars have debated their significance for generations. The divine warning, the construction of a survival vessel, the gathering of living beings or essential seeds, the total destruction of the world by water, the guidance of the boat to safety, the emergence into a renewed earth. The structural skeleton of the story is the same. Some researchers believe this indicates a common origin, perhaps a narrative tradition that travelled along ancient trade routes connecting the Indus Valley with Mesopotamia, carried by merchants and migrants across thousands of miles, and adapted to fit different theological frameworks over centuries. Others suggest that the parallels may reflect independent responses to similar experiences of catastrophic inundation, each culture shaping its encounter with overwhelming water into a narrative that follows a recognizable logic, because survival from flood obeys a certain universal sequence. But the Indian tradition adds something that neither the Mesopotamian nor biblical accounts contain in their primary structures. It embeds the flood within the doctrine of the Yugas, the vast cosmic ages that constitute the Hindu understanding of time. According to this framework, the universe passes through 4 yugas in a descending cycle: the Satya Yuga, the age of truth and perfection; the Treta Yuga, the age of diminished virtue; the Dvapara Yuga, the age of further decline; and the Kali Yuga, the age of darkness and conflict, the age we are currently living in. Each yuga lasts for thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands of human years. At the end of each complete cycle, the universe is dissolved. The flood of Manu is not merely a historical catastrophe. It is the mechanism of cosmic dissolution itself, the process by which a corrupted or completed age is washed away so that a new cycle can begin. This is a vision of time as cyclical rather than linear, where destruction is not an aberration but a necessary phase in an eternal rhythm of creation and renewal. The antiquity of these narratives remains deeply uncertain. The Matsya Purana, as a compiled text, dates to a period somewhere between the 1st and the 5th centuries of the Common Era, but its contents draw upon oral traditions that may be far older, traditions transmitted through generations of reciters and ritual specialists who preserved vast bodies of mythological and cosmological knowledge through memorization and performance. Some scholars have suggested that certain elements of the flood story may echo memories of actual hydrological events in the Indian subcontinent. Perhaps the catastrophic flooding of ancient river systems, the shifting of the Sarasvati River that figures prominently in early Vedic texts, or the inundation of coastal regions by rising sea levels. These possibilities remain debated, and no conclusive archaeological evidence has yet been identified that would pin the narrative to a specific dated disaster. What persists, though, is the archetype, the figure of the solitary survivor, the righteous one who receives divine warning and carries the essential knowledge of the old world into the new. Manu, like Noah, like Utnapishtim, like the survivors we will encounter in China and Mesoamerica and across the Pacific, stands at the boundary between a world that has ended and a world that is beginning. He is not merely a man who escaped a flood. He is the vessel through which civilization itself is preserved and restarted, the conduit between what was lost and what will be rebuilt. And the fact that this archetype appears here, in a tradition that developed on the far side of the Himalayas from Mesopotamia, in a cosmological framework that understands time as cyclical rather than linear, suggests that the memory it encodes may be tapping into something deeper than cultural borrowing, something that echoes across continents, because it echoes across the human experience itself. Continue eastward now beyond the Himalayas and the vast Tibetan plateau, into the river valleys and ancient floodplains of China. Here, the memory of catastrophic water takes a distinctive form. The Chinese tradition does not centre its flood narrative on a single survivor clinging to a boat while the world drowns. Instead, it tells a story of struggle, of generations of effort, of a battle against the waters that would not end until the land itself was reshaped and a new civilization could rise from the mud. The legend unfolds during the reign of Emperor Yao, one of the mythical sage kings of China's earliest remembered past. Yao is portrayed as a ruler of virtue and order, a man who maintained harmony between heaven and earth. But his reign was disrupted by a disaster so immense that the very foundations of the world seemed to buckle. The waters rose, not gently, not as a seasonal swelling of the rivers, but as an apocalyptic inundation that submerged valleys, swallowed villages, and turned the fertile plains between the Yellow River and the Yangtze into an endless churning sea. The texts describe mountains that seem to float like islands above the flood, communities scattered to high ground, fields buried beneath silt and standing water that would not recede. The order that Yao had maintained was dissolved into chaos. The rivers, which should have carried water to the sea in predictable channels, had instead overflowed their banks and merged into a single sprawling deluge that covered everything. Yao sought someone who could confront this catastrophe. He turned to a man named Gun. In some versions of the story, Gun is a noble administrator. In others, he is descended from supernatural beings. But whatever his origins, Gun's approach to the flood was shaped by a particular logic, a logic that would prove fatal to his mission. He believed that the waters could be defeated by containment. He would build walls. He would construct dikes and embankments that could hold the flood back, forcing the raging rivers into confined channels and protecting the settled lands beyond. For 9 years Gun laboured. He raised massive earthworks along the riverbanks. He directed thousands of workers in the moving of soil and stone. He fought the water as an enemy to be imprisoned behind fortifications, and for a time his efforts seemed to work. The dikes held. The waters were restrained. People began to return to the lowlands to plant their fields again, to believe that the disaster had passed. But Gun had misunderstood the nature of what he was fighting. The waters were not a static enemy to be walled away. They were a dynamic force, a living system that obeyed its own logic and followed its own paths. When the next floods came, when the rains intensified and the rivers surged beyond anything the previous years had shown, Gun's deities became not protections but traps. They confined the water until it rose higher and higher, building pressure that no wall of earth could withstand. And then they broke, not gradually, not with warning, but catastrophically. The confined waters erupted through the failing embankments with a violence far greater than an uncontained flood would have produced. The very structures Gun had built to protect the people became the instruments of their destruction. The flood swept through the valleys with renewed fury, carrying away the villages that had been rebuilt behind the dikes, drowning those who had trusted in Gun's walls, leaving ruin across a wider area than the original inundation had ever reached. Yao, despairing, ordered Gun's execution. Some versions say he was exiled. Others say he was put to death directly. In certain tellings, Gun's grief and rage at his failure transformed him into a yellow dragon or a bear, a being of raw elemental force still struggling against the waters even in his altered form. In one particularly haunting variant, Gun's body refused to decay after his death. For 3 years his corpse lay intact, locked in the grip of his unfinished mission. When it was finally cut open, his son Yu emerged, already fully grown, already carrying the knowledge that his father had died without. Yu approached the flood with a fundamentally different understanding. Where Gun had tried to imprison the water, Yu would guide it. Where Gun had built walls against the deluge, Yu would carve channels through the land. His strategy was not confrontation, but redirection. He would not fight the rivers. He would give them paths to the sea. The labour took 13 years. 13 years of digging channels, deepening natural waterways, constructing canals that connected the flooded interior to the ocean. 13 years of travelling across the entire extent of the inundated lands, studying the terrain, understanding where water wanted to flow rather than where he wished it to flow. The myths attribute supernatural strength and endurance to Yu. They say he grew so thin from labour that he could not walk properly, shuffling instead with a distinctive gait that became known as the Yu step, still performed in certain ritual dances today. They say he passed by his own home 3 times during those 13 years and never entered. So consumed was he by the mission that no personal comfort could interrupt it. But the deeper meaning of Yu's success lies not in supernatural attributes, but in the philosophical shift his approach represents. Gun tried to force nature into submission. Yu worked with nature's own tendencies. He understood what the water wanted, where it needed to go, and he gave it those paths. This is not merely a practical lesson in flood management. It is a cosmological principle, a recognition that the order of the world emerges not from imposing human will upon natural forces, but from harmonizing human activity with the patterns that already exist within the landscape. Yu's completion of the flood control works became the founding myth of the Jie dynasty, the first of China's legendary dynastic line. The drained and channeled lands could now be settled, cultivated, organized. The territory that had been chaos became a kingdom. Yu was elevated from flood controller to ruler, from the man who tamed the waters to the man who founded civilization itself. The transition is significant. The control of water is the prerequisite for the control of the land, and the control of the land is the prerequisite for the formation of states, dynasties, the elaborate structures of governance and ritual that constitute what we call civilization. Yu's flood works were not merely engineering. They were the act that made Chinese civilization possible. Archaeological and geological investigations have begun to uncover evidence that these legends may encode memories of actual events. Studies of sediment deposits along the Yellow River have identified signatures of massive ancient floods, catastrophic inundations that reshaped the landscape and displaced communities. One particularly compelling study examined a landslide dam that formed at Jishi Gorge, creating an enormous temporary lake that stretched upstream for miles. When that dam failed, it released a flood pulse of almost unimaginable magnitude, a wall of water that surged downriver with destructive force far exceeding anything a normal seasonal flood could produce. Some researchers believe this event may have occurred around 1900 BCE, roughly corresponding to the traditional dating of the Xia dynasty's emergence. Others have proposed connections to earlier flood signatures in the same region, potentially pushing the timeline further back. These interpretations remain debated. The geological evidence is real, but linking specific sedimentary deposits to specific legendary narratives requires careful inference and remains subject to revision as new data emerges. What is clear, though, is the structural parallel the Chinese tradition shares with flood narratives across every other continent we have examined. A world of order disrupted by catastrophic water, a period of chaos and destruction. And then, not merely survival, but the founding of a new civilizational era from the aftermath of the disaster. Yu does not escape the flood on a boat. He confronts it, learns from his father's failure, and transforms the land itself so that such a flood will never recur. The taming of the waters is the beginning of history, the moment when chaos yields to order and the human world can properly begin. This pattern, appearing in a culture separated by thousands of miles and formidable geographical barriers from Mesopotamia, India, and Egypt, suggests again that we are encountering something more than coincidence, something written into the collective memory of populations that experienced, in their different ways, the same global transformation around the same distant period of the past. The waters rose. The old world was lost. And what came after was something new. Cross the Pacific now, or trace the ancient migration routes north and then south through the Americas, and you arrive in a landscape that remembers catastrophe in a fundamentally different way. In Mesoamerica, the land of highland plateaus and steamy lowlands that would later give rise to the Maya and the Aztec, the memory of destruction is not a single event. It is a pattern, a rhythm, a truth embedded in the very structure of reality itself. The Popol Vuh, the sacred book of the Quiche Maya, opens with a creation story that feels almost alien to the linear narratives of the Near East or China. There is no single flood from which a lone survivor emerges to rebuild the world. Instead, there are multiple attempts, multiple failures. Multiple destructions that sweep away entire races of beings before the gods finally get it right. The story begins in darkness and silence, before the world exists. The creator gods, Tepeu and Gukumats, speak together and their words become reality. Earth, sky, mountains, waters, all emerge from their dialogue. But the gods are not satisfied. They want beings who can worship them, who can speak their names, who can keep the count of days and honour the divine order. So they try to create humans. Their first attempt produces animals. Deer, birds, jaguars, snakes. But these creatures cannot speak. They cannot pray. They can only roar and howl and chatter without meaning. The gods try again. From mud and earth, they fashion a second race. These beings can speak, but they are soft and crumbling. Their bodies dissolve in water. They cannot stand. They cannot remember. Their minds are clouded, and they have no understanding of what they were made for. So the gods destroy them. They break them apart and let them dissolve back into the earth. A third creation follows. The gods fashion humans from wood. These wooden beings are stronger. They multiply and spread across the earth. They build houses and establish communities, but something is still wrong. They have no souls. They cannot feel. They do not remember their creators. They forget to worship. They become arrogant and careless, abusing the animals and the land. And then the punishment comes, not as a gentle correction, but as a total annihilation. The Popol Vuh describes a catastrophe that dismantles the wooden people from every direction. The objects they had abused turn against them. Their cooking pots and grinding stones crush their faces. Their dogs and their turkeys devour their flesh. Their homes collapse on them. The sky darkens, a flood rises from below, a resinous rain that falls from above, a cosmic punishment that does not merely kill but unmakes. The wooden people are not drowned and buried. They are actively torn apart by everything they had mistreated. Those who survive the initial destruction flee to the trees and the hills, trying to climb above the flood. But the mountains themselves shake and throw them down. A few escape by transforming into monkeys, and the Maya say that these monkeys in the forest today are the remnants of that failed creation, creatures that still bear the faint resemblance of humanity, but lack the capacity for speech and understanding. Only after all of this does the gods' final attempt succeed. From a mixture of maize, the sacred crop that would become the foundation of Mesoamerican civilization, they create true humans. These beings can speak, remember, worship, and understand. They are the ancestors of the Maya and all the peoples of the region. The world that exists today is the result of repeated failure, repeated destruction, and finally a creation that worked. The Aztec tradition preserves a similar vision, though expressed in a different framework. Their cosmology describes 5 successive ages or suns, each representing a different era of the world. The first sun was inhabited by giants and ended when jaguars devoured everyone. The second sun ended when fierce winds blew the people away, transforming them into monkeys. The third sun ended in a rain of fire and volcanic destruction. The fourth sun ended in a great flood that turned the surviving people into fish. The current age, the 5th sun, is our own, and according to the Aztec calendar, it too will eventually end, perhaps in earthquakes. Notice what makes these Mesoamerican traditions fundamentally different from the flood narratives we have examined elsewhere. In Mesopotamia, in India, in China, in the Hebrew Bible, the flood is a singular event within a linear timeline. The world exists, a catastrophe destroys it, a survivor rebuilds, and history continues forward from that point. There is a before and an after, a clear direction of time. Mesoamerican thought rejects this linearity. Destruction is not a one-time aberration. It is a structural feature of reality. The world does not proceed from creation to catastrophe to renewal in a straight line. It cycles through creation, failure, destruction, and recreation endlessly. Each age has its own character, its own inhabitants, its own mode of ending. And each ending is total. The beings of a previous age do not merely die. They are transformed, reduced, turned into something lesser. Monkeys, fish, shadows of what they were. Some researchers believe this cyclical framework reflects a deeper understanding of environmental reality in Mesoamerica. The region is subject to recurrent catastrophes, volcanic eruptions that bury entire landscapes in ash, droughts that last for decades, and collapse civilizations, hurricanes that strip the land bare, earthquakes that reshape coastlines. A population that has experienced multiple devastating events across generations might naturally come to understand destruction not as an anomaly, but as an intrinsic part of how the world works. Others argue that the cyclical structure is purely symbolic, a philosophical or theological framework that has no direct connection to historical events. The 4 previous ages, they suggest, represent cosmic principles rather than actual past eras. The wooden people are not a memory of an earlier population. They are an allegory for what humans become when they forget their sacred obligations. This remains debated. What is not debated is the structural parallel that connects Mesoamerican traditions to the global pattern we have been tracing. Around the world, cultures remember a time when an earlier world was destroyed, when beings who resembled humans but lacked something essential were swept away, and when the current age of humanity began, in the aftermath of that annihilation. Whether that memory reflects a single global event around 4200 BCE, a series of regional catastrophes occurring in the same period, or a universal human tendency to encode deep experiences of loss in mythological form, the consistency of the pattern across every continent is striking. Something happened, or something kept happening, and the people who survived it carried that knowledge forward in whatever forms their cultures could preserve. Move north from the highlands of Mesoamerica, across the deserts and grasslands into the vast expanse of what is now the United States and Canada, and you find that the memory of water destroying an earlier world is not confined to a single region or a single people. It is everywhere, among the Apache and the Navajo, among the Caddo and the Chickasaw, among the Micmac and the Montagnais, among the Salish and the Shasta, among the Hopi and the Zuni. The stories vary in their details, in their characters, in their explanations for why the flood came. But the core structure remains remarkably consistent. A world exists, something goes wrong, water rises. Almost everyone dies. A few survive, often through a warning from an animal or a spirit, often by finding a vessel or a refuge of some kind. And from those survivors, the current world is rebuilt. The Hopi of the American Southwest tell of 3 previous worlds, each destroyed when the people living in them strayed from their proper path. In the first world, the people became corrupt and violent, and the world was destroyed by fire. In the second world, the same pattern repeated, and the world was destroyed by ice. In the third world, the people again fell into disorder, and this time the destruction came by water. A great flood covered the earth. Only a few survived, guided by Spider-Woman, a powerful spirit who helped them find refuge in hollow reeds that floated on the surface of the rising waters. When the floods receded, the survivors climbed out of their reeds and emerged into the fourth world, the world we now inhabit. But even this world, the Hopi say, is not permanent. It too will eventually be destroyed if people forget their obligations to the earth and to each other. The Caddo people of the Great Plains tell a different version of the same essential story. In their tradition, a great flood once covered the entire earth, drowning every living creature except a single woman and a single man. These 2 survivors climbed to the highest peak they could find, but the waters kept rising, threatening to swallow even that last refuge. Then a dove appeared and led them to a large tree growing on the mountain top. Inside the hollow trunk, they found safety. When the waters finally receded, they emerged alone in a devastated world. They had children, and their children had children, and slowly the earth was repopulated. Among the Salish peoples of the Pacific Northwest, the flood story features a clever survivor who anticipates the catastrophe rather than simply receiving a divine warning. A man notices that the water in the river is rising even though no rain has fallen. He understands that something unprecedented is happening. He ties his canoe to the top of a tall tree with a long rope, and as the flood rises, his canoe rises with it. He floats above the drowned world, anchored to the highest point he can reach, waiting until the waters recede. When he finally comes down, he is the only human left. But the animals have also survived, clinging to floating debris or swimming through the endless sea. Together, the man and the surviving animals begin the slow work of rebuilding. The Mi'kmaq of eastern Canada preserve a tradition in which the flood is sent as a punishment for human cruelty, specifically for the mistreatment of animals. In their story, a great whale becomes stranded on the shore, and instead of helping it return to the water, the people torment it and kill it. In response, the ocean rises. The water climbs higher and higher, covering the land completely. Only one family survives because they had refused to participate in the cruelty. They take refuge on a high hill, and when the flood finally recedes, they find themselves alone. The animals that had been abused are gone, but new animals begin to appear, born from the sea itself, and the world slowly regains its living inhabitants. What makes these native North American flood traditions so striking is not just their content, but their distribution. They appear across an enormous geographic range, from the deserts of the southwest to the forests of the northeast, from the plains of the Midwest to the coastlines of the Pacific. And they appear among peoples who speak languages from completely different families: Athabascan, Algonquian, Siouan, Salishan, Uto-Aztecan, languages as unrelated to each other as English is to Mandarin, as Arabic is to Japanese. These are not peoples who shared a common origin story that they carried with them from some ancestral homeland. They are peoples whose ancestors arrived in the Americas through different migrations at different times, peoples who developed their cultures in isolation from each other for thousands of years. And yet they all remember a flood. Some researchers believe this widespread pattern suggests that the story of a great deluge was carried into the Americas by the earliest migrants, thousands of years before 4200 BCE, and then adapted to local environments over millennia. The core structure survived, but the details changed. The vessel became a reed in the desert, a hollow tree in the plains, a canoe in the coastal forests. The warning came from Spider-Woman in one tradition, from a dove in another, from personal observation in a third. The animals involved were always local, the geography always specific, but the underlying narrative remained the same. Others argue that the distribution of flood stories across unrelated language groups might point to something else entirely. If peoples who had no contact with each other, who had no shared cultural tradition, independently developed stories about a world-destroying flood, then perhaps the experience that generated those stories was not inherited but witnessed. Perhaps something happened in North America, or across the entire globe, around 4200 BCE, that was so catastrophic, so total in its destruction, that every group that survived it carried the memory forward, encoding it in whatever symbolic forms their culture could sustain. This remains debated. The data is ambiguous, but the pattern is undeniable. Across every region of native North America, among peoples with no linguistic or cultural connection, the water remembers what the land has tried to forget. Cross the ocean, move west, far west, beyond the Americas, beyond the islands of the Pacific, until you reach a landmass that has existed in near total isolation for tens of thousands of years. Australia. If the pattern we have traced across every other continent holds true, if the memory of a world-resetting flood around 4200 BCE is truly a shared human inheritance, then it should appear here too, buried in the oldest continuous oral traditions on the planet. And it does. The Aboriginal peoples of Australia do not speak of their deep past as a series of historical events, the way Western cultures do. They speak of it as the Dreamtime or the dreaming. The Dreamtime is not a dream in the sense of something unreal or imaginary. It is a parallel dimension of reality, a time before time when the land itself was shapeless, when the ancestors who lived then were not quite human and not quite spirit, but something in between. These ancestral beings moved across the flat, formless earth, and as they moved, they shaped it. A giant serpent pushing through the soil carved the path of a river. An ancestor sleeping in a hollow formed a valley. The mountains, the waterholes, the deserts, the coastlines, all of them were created during the Dreamtime, and all of them still carry the imprint of the beings who made them. The Dreamtime is not over. It is ongoing. The ancestors are still present in the landscape, still active, still shaping the world through rituals and stories that connect living people to the deep past. What makes the Dreamtime so extraordinary from an anthropological perspective is its sheer depth. Aboriginal oral traditions are not recent inventions. They are not stories composed a few centuries ago and projected backward into a mythological past. Some researchers believe they contain elements that are genuinely ancient, possibly tens of thousands of years old, preserved through rigorous systems of knowledge transmission that far exceed anything seen in other human cultures. Elders are responsible for maintaining specific stories with exact precision. A single word cannot be changed. A single detail cannot be omitted. The stories are sung, danced, painted on rock, woven into the fabric of daily life, and passed from generation to generation with a fidelity that borders on the impossible. And within this vast, intricate web of Dreamtime narratives, there are stories of water destroying an earlier world. Among the Aboriginal peoples of the coastal regions, stories of great floods are surprisingly common. The Tiwi people of the islands north of Darwin tell of a time when the sea rose suddenly and covered the land. Only a few people survived, clinging to the highest points of the islands until the water retreated and they could descend to rebuild their world. The Gaguju people, whose traditional lands include what is now Kakadu National Park, preserve stories of a great inundation that transformed the landscape entirely, turning dry ground into wetlands and forcing the ancestors to find new ways to survive in a changed country. In the traditions of multiple Aboriginal groups along the southern coast, there are accounts of the ocean advancing over the land, swallowing territories that had once been dry, pushing the people inland, and permanently altering the shape of the coastline. These are not vague symbolic tales of chaos and renewal. They are specific, detailed descriptions of water rising and land disappearing, tied to identifiable geographic features, preserved in the precise language of the dreaming. This is where the Australian evidence becomes genuinely startling. In recent decades, geologists and geomorphologists studying the Australian coastline have discovered something unexpected. Aboriginal oral traditions describing coastal inundation match, with remarkable accuracy, the actual geological record of sea level rise at the end of the last ice age. Stories that describe specific areas of coastline being submerged, that name particular landmarks that now lie underwater, that recount the advance of the sea across identifiable territories, correspond to events that happened between 10,000 and 7,000 years ago, when melting glaciers caused the ocean to rise over 100 meters globally. In some cases, researchers have been able to identify the exact submerged features described in the stories, features that have been underwater for millennia, features that would be invisible to anyone living today without sonar or satellite mapping. This suggests that Aboriginal oral traditions can preserve accurate geographic information for at least 7,000 years, possibly much longer. If they can remember the coastline as it existed before the Holocene sea level rise, it is entirely possible that they could also remember a dramatic climate event around 4,200 BCE. The isolation of Australia makes this possibility deeply significant. Aboriginal peoples have been living on the Australian continent for at least 50,000 years, possibly 65,000 years, with minimal outside contact until the arrival of Europeans in the 18th century. They did not interact with the peoples of Mesopotamia, or Egypt, or India, or China. They did not share stories with the ancestors of the Hopi, or the Caddo, or the Micmac. They were, for tens of thousands of years, on their own evolutionary and cultural trajectory, developing their own systems of knowledge, their own ways of understanding the world. And yet, like every other culture we have examined, they remember a time when water reshaped everything. They remember an inundation. They remember survival. They remember a world before and a world after. This remains debated. Some researchers argue that Aboriginal flood stories are simply local memories of the post-glacial sea level rise, events that happened thousands of years before 4,200 BCE and have nothing to do with the global pattern we are tracing. Others point out that the 5.9 Kiloyear event, the abrupt climate shift around 4,200 BCE that we saw reflected in ice cores and sediments, affected Australia as well. The Australian climate record shows a significant drying trend at exactly this period, the termination of a wet phase and the beginning of extended aridity that would eventually turn large parts of the interior into desert. If the climate changed that dramatically, it is possible that sea levels and rainfall patterns shifted too, causing localized flooding in some areas even as drought struck others. A continent as vast as Australia would not experience a single uniform catastrophe. Different regions would face different consequences. But the experience of sudden, irreversible change, the feeling that the world you had known was being erased and replaced by something harsher and stranger, might have been shared across the entire continent. It is possible that the Dreamtime stories of inundation and transformation encode not just one event, but multiple events, layered on top of each other, compressed into a single narrative framework that describes the essential truth of what happened without preserving the exact chronology. The land changed, the water moved, the ancestors had to adapt. The world was reset. Whether this happened once or many times, whether the timing aligns precisely with 4200 BCE or spans a longer period, the underlying message is the same. Something came that altered the foundations of life, and the people who survived it never forgot. They folded the memory into the Dreamtime, made it part of the landscape itself, sang it into existence over and over across tens of thousands of years, until it became not just a story, but a structural element of reality as they understood it. The flood was not just an event, it was a feature of the world woven into the same fabric as the rivers and the mountains and the sky. We have travelled across Australia, listening to the Dreamtime stories of water reshaping the land, stories preserved for what may be 7,000 years or more. But now, let us return to the continent where our species first found its footing, Africa. We have already examined Egypt's memory of Zep Tepi, the first time, that forgotten golden age before a catastrophic reset. But Egypt is just one chapter in a vast and diverse continent. Beyond the Nile, beyond the pyramids and the hieroglyphs, sub-Saharan Africa holds its own deep reservoirs of memory. And these memories do not always speak of water. The challenge with African oral traditions, and with oral traditions everywhere, is one of dating. A written record can be placed in time. We can examine the clay of a Sumerian tablet or the papyrus of an Egyptian scroll and determine with reasonable certainty when it was created. Oral histories do not carry such timestamps. They exist in a flowing present, continuously transmitted from elder to apprentice, from generation to generation, adapting to new contexts while striving to maintain their core truths. When a Yoruba elder recites the founding myths of his people, or a Zulu storyteller recounts the journey of his ancestors, we cannot simply assign a date of origin. The story may contain elements that are centuries old, or it may contain elements that are thousands of years old, compressed and reshaped by countless retellings. Some researchers believe that oral traditions can preserve genuine historical information for far longer than we typically assume, just as we saw with the Aboriginal Dreamtime narratives. But this remains a subject of intense debate among historians and anthropologists. We must approach these stories with respect and curiosity, treating them as potential windows into deep time, while acknowledging that we cannot verify their chronology with the same confidence we apply to written records. With that caution in mind, let us listen to what sub-Saharan African traditions remember. Across the vast stretches of the continent below the Sahara, flood narratives are surprisingly rare. This makes sense geographically. Central and southern Africa are not low-lying river deltas vulnerable to inundation. They are high plateaus, savannas, forests, and mountain ranges. A global flood, even a significant one, would not necessarily submerge these landscapes. But what these traditions do remember with striking consistency is something else entirely. Drought, migration, upheaval, a great change that forced entire peoples to abandon their homelands and seek new territories. The Yoruba people of West Africa, one of the largest ethnic groups on the continent, preserve complex oral histories describing a primordial period of chaos and transformation. Their traditions speak of a time when the harmony between humans and the natural world was broken, when the rains failed, when the land became hostile, and when the ancestors were forced to migrate from their original territories to find a new place where life could flourish. These migrations are not presented as casual relocations. They are described as desperate journeys undertaken under extreme duress, leaving behind a homeland that could no longer sustain human life. Similar themes echo across the continent. Among the Bantu-speaking peoples, whose descendants today span thousands of miles from Central Africa to the southern tip, oral traditions frequently reference a catastrophic drought that preceded their great expansion. The Bantu migration is one of the most significant population movements in human history, a slow, massive wave of people spreading across the continent over thousands of years. What triggered this expansion remains debated among archaeologists and linguists. Some point to agricultural innovations, others to population pressure. But the oral traditions themselves consistently frame the beginning of the migration as a response to crisis, a time when the land failed and the people had to move or die. Now, connect this back to what we examined earlier, the Sahara's transformation, around 4200 BCE, the green savanna that had sustained human populations across North Africa for thousands of years collapsed with extraordinary speed. The monsoons shifted, the lakes dried, the grasslands turned to sand. And the people who had been living in that fertile corridor, the pastoralists, the fishermen, the hunter-gatherers, they were forced to move. They migrated south into the Sahel and the sub-Saharan regions. They migrated east toward the Nile and the emerging civilization of Egypt. They migrated in all directions, carrying with them the memory of a homeland that had died. It is possible that the drought and migration themes preserved in sub-Saharan oral traditions encode, however faintly, the real environmental history of the Sahara's desertification. That the Yoruba stories of a broken world and a forced journey, that the Bantu traditions of a great drought preceding their expansion, are distant echoes of an actual event, the sudden, devastating end of the African humid period around 4200 BCE. This does not mean that these stories describe the 5.9 Kiloyear event with precise accuracy. Oral traditions are not recordings, they are living, evolving narratives that adapt to the needs of each generation while preserving what the culture considers essential. What seems to have been preserved across thousands of years and thousands of miles is the core experience. The world changed, the rains stopped, the land became hostile. The people had to move. That essential truth, stripped of specific dates and geographic details, may reflect a real environmental catastrophe that reshaped the entire continent. The Sahara died, the green turned to sand, and the memory of that death, filtered through countless generations of storytellers, may still be present in the oral traditions of the peoples who descended from those who fled south and east, carrying nothing but their survival and their stories. If oral memory can preserve accurate geographic information for 7,000 years, as the Australian evidence suggests, it is at least plausible that it can preserve the emotional and environmental essence of a continental catastrophe for a similar span of time. Not the exact year, not the exact location, but the truth that something came, something that changed everything, and that the world before was fundamentally different from the world after. We have listened to the voices carried through oral tradition, the stories of drought and migration preserved across Africa and beyond. But what happens when the voices fall silent? What happens when the only testimony left behind is the testimony of stone? To answer that, we must travel to a hilltop in southeastern Turkey, to a site that has already reshaped everything we thought we knew about human history, Gobekli Tepe. We mentioned this site earlier, but now we must return to it, because Gobekli Tepe holds a secret that may speak directly to the reset we have been tracing. Gobekli Tepe is old, almost incomprehensibly old for a monument of this scale. It was built around 9600 BCE at the very dawn of the Neolithic, 7,000 years before the 5.9 Kiloyear event. This was a time when humans were still supposed to be simple hunter-gatherers, wandering across the landscape in small bands, scrabbling for survival. Nobody was supposed to be building temples. Nobody was supposed to be carving massive stone pillars weighing tons, decorating them with intricate reliefs of animals, arranging them in perfect geometric circles that required sophisticated engineering and massive coordinated labour. Yet someone did. Someone or some group organised hundreds of people over generations to construct something that served no practical survival purpose. It was not a shelter, it was not a fortress, It was not a storage facility. It was, by every reasonable interpretation, a sanctuary, a place of gathering, of ritual, of meaning. This alone is staggering. But what happened next is even more mysterious, and potentially far more relevant to our story. Gobekli Tepe was not simply abandoned, it was deliberately buried, intentionally, methodically, painstakingly covered with tons of earth and rubble, entombed beneath an artificial hill. This was not the slow accumulation of wind-blown dust or the gradual silting of abandoned ruins. The archaeological evidence shows that people came back again and again, over centuries, and filled in these monumental structures with care and purpose. They did not destroy them. They did not deface the carvings. They did not repurpose the stones for other building projects. They buried them, preserved them, silenced them. Some researchers believe this deliberate burial was an act of ritual closure, a way of putting the site to sleep, of formally ending its purpose in the life of the community. Others suggest it may have been an attempt to protect the site, to hide it from something, perhaps from invading groups, perhaps from a changing world that no longer had room for such grand expressions of meaning. This remains fiercely debated. What is not debated is the fact itself. Gobekli Tepe was intentionally buried, and it remained buried for over 10,000 years, hidden beneath the earth, until a Kurdish shepherd noticed something odd about the hill in 1994. Now, consider the timeline. Gobekli Tepe's period of active use spanned roughly 1,000 years, from around 9,600 BCE to around 8,600 BCE. After that activity at the site diminished, new construction ceased. The great circles fell into disuse, and then over the centuries that followed, the burial began. What was happening in the broader world during this period? The same thing we have been tracing throughout this entire narrative. The climate was shifting. The post-glacial optimum, that warm, wet period that had allowed the green Sahara to flourish, had begun to fluctuate. The monsoons were becoming less reliable. The ecological stability that had supported the rich, diverse environments of the early Holocene was starting to fracture. By the time Gobekli Tepe was being buried, the world was already moving toward the crisis that would culminate around 4,200 BCE. It is possible that the people who tended this site sensed what was coming. Not in the way we sense weather by reading the sky, but in the way cultures sense deep change, by accumulating generations of observation, by noticing that the rains come later now, that the streams run thinner, that the animals do not return to the same places they once did. Now let us move forward in time and westward in space to another site that echoes some of these same themes. Çatalhöyük, one of the world's earliest large settlements, a sprawling Neolithic village in central Anatolia that housed thousands of people between roughly 7,400 and 5,600 BCE. Çatalhöyük was not a temple complex like Gobekli Tepe. It was a living place, a dense cluster of mud brick houses where people cooked, slept, raised children, buried their dead beneath their floors, and covered their walls with vivid paintings of animals, hunting scenes and strange abstract patterns. For nearly 2,000 years, Çatalhöyük thrived. But then, around 5,600 BCE, something changed. The settlement began to contract. House density decreased. The elaborate wall paintings became simpler, then disappeared entirely. The ritual burials beneath the floors became less frequent, and eventually, perhaps around the time of the 5.9 Kiloyear event, or shortly thereafter, Çatalhöyük was abandoned entirely. Not destroyed, not conquered, simply left behind, its people dispersed, moving to smaller settlements scattered across the surrounding landscape. What does this transformation tell us? Some archaeologists interpret Çatalhöyük's decline as a natural evolution, a community simply growing beyond the capacity of its location and moving on. Others see something more troubling in the pattern, a society gradually losing its cohesion, its shared rituals, its collective identity before finally dissolving. The timing falling so close to the broader climate shift we have been documenting is at least suggestive. It is possible that the same environmental pressures that killed the Green Sahara and displaced the sub-Saharan pastoralists also reached into Anatolia, making the once rich landscape around Catalhoyuk less able to support such a dense concentration of people. When the rains fail, when the harvests shrink, when the wild game diminishes, large settlements become unsustainable. People scatter. The community that once gathered around shared walls and shared rituals fragments into smaller, more mobile groups, better equipped to survive in a depleted environment. Now, place these two sites side by side in your mind. Gobekli Tepe, a ritual centre deliberately silenced and buried as the climate began to shift. Catalhoyuk, a living community gradually hollowed out and abandoned as that shift intensified and culminated. Both sites suggest something profound about cultural memory and what a reset actually looks like on the ground. It does not look like fire and brimstone. It does not look like sudden annihilation. It looks like people carefully, deliberately putting their most sacred places to sleep. It looks like shared rituals fading away. It looks like walls emptying of their paintings, floors emptying of their burials, houses emptying of their families. It looks like a long, slow forgetting. A society that once knew how to coordinate hundreds of people to build monuments to meaning, gradually losing the capacity to maintain even a single shared ritual. What these sites suggest is that the reset of 4200 BCE was not just environmental. It was cultural. It was cognitive. The climate shift stripped away the material conditions that made complex social organization possible, and when those conditions collapsed, something inside the human community collapsed as well. The threads that held people together, the shared stories, the shared rituals, the shared purposes, they frayed and snapped. Not everywhere, not in every community, but in enough places across enough centuries that the world before and the world after became fundamentally different kinds of human existence. Gobekli Tepe stones still sit beneath that artificial hill, silent, patient, holding whatever message their builders intended to preserve. We are still learning how to read them, but their silence itself may be the most eloquent testimony we have. Someone long ago decided that this place needed to be protected from what was coming. They buried it carefully, lovingly, as though they believed that one day someone might come back and unearth it again. Someone might remember. Someone might listen to what the stones had to say about the world before the change. We are those someone. We have come back. We are listening. From the silence of Gobekli Tepe's buried stones and the emptying walls of Catalhoyuk, we move further west, deeper into Europe, to cultures that should not have existed in the form they did, and to a disappearance that mirrors the slow forgetting we have already traced. Southeastern Europe, the region we now call the Balkans, was home to some of the most sophisticated societies of the ancient world, societies that modern archaeology is still struggling to fully understand. Two of these stand out above all others, the Vinca culture and the Varna culture. They existed long before the pyramids of Egypt, long before the ziggurats of Mesopotamia, in a time when this region was supposed to be home to nothing more than simple farming villages. But what researchers found beneath the soil of Serbia, Romania and Bulgaria told a completely different story. The Vinca culture flourished between roughly 5,500 and 4,500 BCE. For 1,000 years they built settlements that were astonishingly complex for their era. Not scattered huts, but organized towns with streets, with designated areas for crafts and ritual, with houses that were rebuilt generation after generation on the same foundations, creating tell mounds that rose above the plains like miniature mountains of human endeavor. They were master potters. creating vessels of such quality and aesthetic refinement that some archaeologists have argued they represent the earliest true artistic tradition in Europe. But what makes the Vinca culture truly extraordinary and truly mysterious is something else entirely. Symbols, small, carefully inscribed markings found on pottery, on figurines, on spindle whorls. These symbols are not random decorations. They repeat in consistent patterns across vast distances, appearing on artifacts from sites hundreds of kilometers apart. Some researchers believe these markings represent a proto-writing system, a form of communication that predates the script of Mesopotamia by thousands of years. If this interpretation is correct, it means the people of the Vinca culture had developed symbolic notation, the ability to encode and transmit abstract information across time and space long before any other known culture. This remains fiercely debated. Skeptics argue the symbols are merely decorative, proprietary marks identifying the maker or the owner, not true writing. But even if they are not writing in the full sense, they represent a cognitive leap, a society that had begun to externalize thought, to make meaning visible and durable. Then there is Varna. In 1972, a worker at a construction site near the Black Sea coast of Bulgaria uncovered what would become one of the most spectacular archaeological discoveries of the 20th century. The Varna necropolis, a cemetery dating to roughly 4600 BCE, contained graves filled with an astonishing quantity of gold. More gold than had been found in any other archaeological site of this era anywhere in the world. Golden bracelets, golden rings, golden scepters, golden diadems. One single burial, grave 43, contained more gold objects than the rest of the world's known archaeological sites from this entire period combined. The person buried there, likely a community leader or ritual specialist, had been laid to rest with over a kilogram of pure gold. This was not simple decoration. This was a statement, a declaration of power, of status, of something beyond mere survival. It also revealed something else. The Varna culture possessed metallurgical skills that were centuries ahead of their time. They were not just hammering native gold into crude shapes. They were smelting, casting, alloying. They had developed sophisticated techniques for working with copper and gold that should not have existed in this region for another 1,000 years. The implication is profound. Southeastern Europe was not a backwater waiting for civilization to arrive from the east. It was a centre of innovation, a place where human ingenuity was pushing against the boundaries of what was possible, creating technologies and social structures that were unprecedented. And then both cultures vanished. Not gradually, in the way Catalhoyuk slowly hollowed out over centuries, but relatively quickly. Around 4500 BCE, possibly even earlier, the Vinca settlements began to contract. The elaborate pottery simplified, the symbols disappeared from the artifacts, the organized towns fragmented into smaller, less coordinated villages. The Varna culture followed a similar trajectory. The spectacular gold work ceased. The large necropolis fell out of use. The population dispersed. Something had broken the thread that held these societies together, the thread of shared meaning, shared skill, shared purpose that had allowed them to create things no one had created before. As with all the vanishings we have examined, the question of cause remains open and contested. Some researchers point to invasion, to the arrival of new populations from the steppes to the northeast, the early Indo-European speakers whose migrations would eventually reshape the linguistic and genetic map of Europe. The archaeological record does show changes in material culture during this period. New pottery styles, new burial practices, new settlement patterns that suggest the arrival of outsiders. It is possible that these incoming groups disrupted the existing social order, that they brought conflict, competition, or simply a different way of life that supplanted the older traditions. This interpretation has a long history in archaeological thought, but it has also been criticized, sometimes harshly, for assuming that cultural change must always come from outside, for defaulting to invasion narratives when other explanations might suffice. Other researchers see a different pattern, one that echoes the environmental stresses we have been tracing across every continent. The timing of the Vinca and Varna decline, falling in the centuries just before and around the 5.9 Kiloyear event, aligns with broader climate deterioration. Southeastern Europe was not immune to the shifts that killed the Green Sahara and displaced the pastoralists of sub-Saharan Africa. The same monsoon failures that parched North Africa would have reduced rainfall across the Mediterranean and the Balkans. Agricultural yields would have declined. The rich floodplains that had supported dense settlement would have become less reliable. When the material foundation of a society crumbles, the cultural superstructure does not survive intact. You cannot maintain proto-writing systems when the communities that use them are fragmenting. You cannot sustain metallurgical innovation when the trade networks that supply raw materials are disrupted. You cannot bury leaders in kilograms of gold when the social organization that creates such wealth is dissolving. The environmental explanation does not require invasion. It requires only what we have already seen elsewhere. The slow, relentless pressure of a changing climate forcing people to adapt, to simplify, to abandon what they cannot maintain, and scatter into smaller, more sustainable groups. Most likely, both factors played a role. Climate stress weakened the foundation. Migration pressure, driven by the same climate stress affecting other regions, pushed displaced groups into new territories, creating competition for diminishing resources. The combination proved fatal to cultures that had been built on abundance and stability. When the world changed, they could not change fast enough to preserve what made them extraordinary. The gold stayed buried. The symbols fell silent. The towns emptied. And another thread in the fabric of human memory snapped, leaving only fragments behind. Fragments that we are still piecing together, still trying to understand, still listening to in the hope that they might tell us something about what the world was like before the change. From the silent gold of Varna and the fading symbols of the Vinca culture, we turn to the people who may have stepped into the void left behind. When the established orders of southeastern Europe fragmented, when the climate stress of the 5.9 Kiloyear event cracked the foundations of those extraordinary societies, the landscape did not stay empty for long. New people arrived, or perhaps more accurately, old people were forced to move. This brings us to one of the most debated questions in all of archaeology and linguistics, the mystery of the Indo-European expansion. Today, nearly half the world's population speaks a language descended from a single ancestral tongue. English, Spanish, Russian, Hindi, Persian, Bengali, all of them trace their roots back to what linguists call Proto-Indo-European, a language that existed before writing, before recorded history, spoken by a people whose identity has been hunted by scholars for over a century. The question of who these original speakers were and where they lived has generated endless theories and intense disagreement. But in recent decades, a convergence of genetic and archaeological evidence has pointed toward a specific region, the Pontic-Caspian steppe, the vast grasslands stretching north of the Black Sea from Ukraine into southern Russia. For a long time, the timing of the Indo-European expansion remained uncertain. Some theories placed it much earlier, others much later. But a growing body of research now suggests that a major wave of steppe migration occurred right around the period we have been examining, roughly between 3,500 and 2,500 BCE, potentially beginning in the centuries immediately following the 5.9 Kiloyear event. It is possible that the same climate disruption that killed the Green Sahara and destabilized the Vinca and Varna cultures also set something enormous in motion on the steppe. Here is how that might have worked. Before the climate shift, The steppe populations were relatively settled pastoralists, herding sheep and cattle, moving seasonally but staying within familiar territory. They were skilled, adaptable, but they were not yet the expansive force they would become. When the global climate pattern changed around 4200 BCE, the monsoon belts shifted. The rainfall that had nourished certain regions retreated. But on the steppe, the effect may have been different. Some researchers believe that the climate shift actually expanded the grasslands in certain northern zones, creating vast new pastures while simultaneously stressing the agricultural societies to the south and west. The steppe herders found themselves with more land, more grazing territory, and crucially, more horses. The domestication of the horse, likely achieved by these steppe communities sometime before 3500 BCE, changed everything. It did not just provide transportation, it provided range. It provided speed. It provided the ability to traverse distances that would have been impossible on foot, to drive herds across hundreds of miles of open grassland, to communicate between scattered groups with unprecedented efficiency. And it provided, eventually, the chariot and the mounted warrior, though those innovations would come later. But even the earliest horse domestication created a kind of mobility that no other human population possessed at this time. The steppe peoples became, in essence, the first rapid response adapters of the ancient world. When resources shifted, they could follow them. When territories opened up, they could claim them. When societies to their south and west began to fragment under climate stress, they could move into the gaps. The genetic evidence tells a complicated story. Ancient DNA recovered from archaeological sites across Europe and Asia shows a clear signal of steppe ancestry appearing in populations that previously showed none of it. This ancestry, often associated with a specific genetic profile linked to the Yamnaya culture of the steppe, shows up suddenly in Central Europe around 3000 BCE, in Scandinavia shortly after, and eventually in South Asia as well. The speed and scale of this genetic shift is striking. In some regions it appears almost overnight in archaeological terms, replacing or heavily mixing with the existing population within a few generations. This is not gradual cultural diffusion. This is movement. People carrying their genes, their animals, their technologies, and their languages across vast distances in a relatively short time. But the picture is not simple. Other researchers caution against reading this genetic evidence as a straightforward story of conquest or replacement. The mixing was complex, variable from region to region. In some places, steppe ancestry dominates. In others, it appears as a minor component, suggesting integration rather than invasion. The archaeological record also shows continuity alongside change. Old pottery styles persist alongside new ones. Existing settlement patterns shift, but do not always disappear. What we may be seeing is not a single dramatic expansion, but a series of pulses, waves of migration driven by successive climate fluctuations, each wave carrying steppe peoples further into new territories, mixing with local populations and spreading their language and culture through a combination of demographic pressure, social dominance, and technological advantage. The languages likely spread not through deliberate conquest, but through something more subtle and more powerful. Social networks, trade connections, intermarriage. The adoption of steppe technologies, wagons, horses, metallurgy, by neighbouring peoples who found these innovations advantageous. When you adopt someone's technology, you often adopt their vocabulary for it. When you marry into their networks, your children learn their language. Over centuries, over generations, a language can spread far beyond the territory of its original speakers, not through force, but through utility, through connection, through the quiet necessity of communication in a world where boundaries are shifting and old identities are dissolving. This is where the Indo-European question connects back to the broader pattern we have been tracing. The 5.9 Kiloyear event did not just destroy. It rearranged. It took a world of settled, regionally distinct cultures and shook them like a kaleidoscope, creating new configurations, new alignments, new possibilities. The steppe populations, buffered by their mobility and their animals, were positioned to take advantage of this rearrangement. They became the vectors of a new order, carrying languages and genes and technologies across a landscape that had been emptied and disrupted by forces larger than any human intention. Migration in this context is not just movement, it is adaptation, it is survival. It is the human response to a world that has changed beyond recognition, the decision to leave what no longer sustains you and search for something that might. So we have traced the echoes, the silent stones of Gobekli Tepe, the vanishing gold of Varna, the shifting sands of the Sahara, and the sprawling languages of the steppe. But all of these responses, all of these human adaptations and rearrangements were set in motion by something. Something pushed the climate. Something broke the pattern. The world did not simply decide to change on its own. The 5.9 Kiloyear event had a trigger, and identifying that trigger has become one of the most intriguing open questions in climate science and archaeology. Researchers have proposed three main categories of explanation: volcanic, solar, and cosmic. Each has evidence, each has weaknesses, and none has yet closed the case. Let us start with the Earth itself. Volcanic eruption theories propose that a massive eruption, or possibly a series of large eruptions occurring close together, injected enormous quantities of ash and sulfate gases into the atmosphere. These aerosols would have reflected sunlight back into space, temporarily cooling the planet and disrupting global weather patterns. The evidence for this comes from several sources. Ice cores from Greenland and Antarctica contain layers of sulfate deposits that correspond to periods of increased volcanic activity. Some researchers have identified elevated sulfate signals around the time of the 5.9 Kiloyear event, suggesting a major eruption occurred shortly before or during the climate shift. Additionally, geological surveys have found ash layers in Mediterranean and Middle Eastern sediment cores that date roughly to this period, indicating significant volcanic activity in the region. But the volcanic theory faces substantial challenges. The sulfate signals in the ice cores, while present, are not as large as those associated with other confirmed climate-altering eruptions, like the one that caused the year without a summer in 1816. To trigger a global drought lasting centuries, you would need an eruption of truly extraordinary magnitude, something on the scale of a supervolcano. And so far, geologists have not identified any eruption site that matches both the timing and the necessary scale. It is possible that multiple moderate eruptions occurred in quick succession, compounding their effects, but that remains speculative. The volcanic theory can explain a sudden brief cooling, but it struggles to explain the prolonged, multi-century drought that characterizes the 5.9 Kiloyear event. Volcanic aerosols settle out of the atmosphere within a few years. They do not typically cause centuries of altered rainfall patterns. This brings us to the Sun. Solar activity fluctuations offer a different mechanism. The Sun's output is not constant. It varies over time, cycling through periods of higher and lower activity on timescales ranging from decades to centuries. During periods of low solar activity, the Earth receives slightly less energy, and global climate patterns can shift. The most famous example is the Maunder Minimum, a period of very low solar activity in the late 17th century that coincided with some of the coldest years of the Little Ice Age in Europe. Some researchers believe that a similar, but more pronounced, solar minimum occurred around 4200 BCE. This prolonged dip in solar output could have weakened monsoon systems globally, reducing rainfall across the tropics and subtropics, and shifting temperature and precipitation belts in ways that match the observed effects of the 5.9 Kiloyear event. The evidence for solar theories comes primarily from cosmogenic isotopes, elements like carbon-14 and beryllium-10 that are produced in the atmosphere when cosmic rays reach the Earth. When solar activity is high, the Sun's magnetic field deflects more cosmic rays, and production of these isotopes decreases. When solar activity is low, more cosmic rays get through, and isotope production increases. Tree rings and ice cores preserve records of these fluctuations. Some studies do show elevated levels of carbon-14 around the period in question, hinting at reduced solar activity. However, this evidence is contested. The carbon-14 record for this period is complicated by other factors, including changes in the Earth's carbon cycle and ocean circulation. And while solar minima can certainly influence climate, most climate models suggest that the magnitude of solar forcing required to cause a centuries-long global drought would be exceptionally large, larger than anything observed in the last few thousand years. The solar theory provides a plausible mechanism for long-duration climate change, but the required scale remains difficult to confirm. Finally, we reach the most dramatic hypothesis, the cosmic theories. Some researchers have proposed that a cometary impact or an airburst, an explosion occurring in the atmosphere without leaving a traditional crater, could have triggered the 5.9 Kiloyear event. The idea is that a large object entering the atmosphere would have released enormous energy, potentially igniting widespread fires, injecting dust and debris into the stratosphere, and disrupting climate patterns for extended periods. The supporting evidence for this hypothesis is fragmentary and heavily disputed. Proponents point to alleged impact markers found in sediment layers from various locations, including elevated levels of certain elements, like iridium, microscopic spherules that could indicate high-temperature melting, and charcoal concentrations suggesting widespread burning. Some have also pointed to geological features they interpret as possible impact structures, though these identifications remain controversial. Critics of the cosmic theories raise significant objections. Many of the claimed impact markers have not been consistently reproduced across multiple sites. The evidence is scattered, and often comes from contexts where similar markers could be produced by non-impact processes like volcanic activity or natural forest fires. No definitive impact crater from this period has been identified, and airbursts of the necessary scale are considered extremely rare. While it is certainly possible that a cosmic object played some role, the current evidence does not meet the standard required to confirm such an extraordinary claim. So where does this leave us with three possibilities, each intriguing, each incomplete? A volcanic eruption could explain a sudden shock, but struggles with duration. A solar minimum could explain duration, but struggles with magnitude. A cosmic impact could explain both, but struggles with evidence. It is possible that the truth involves a combination, a volcanic eruption coinciding with a solar minimum, or a cosmic trigger amplified by pre-existing climate vulnerability. Some researchers have even suggested that the climate system may have been hovering near a tipping point already, and that any sufficient push, volcanic, solar, or cosmic, could have sent it cascading into a new state. The exact trigger remains an open scientific question. We know the effect. We can trace its consequences across every continent, in every myth, in every abandoned settlement, in every shifted boundary. But the cause, the specific event that set the kaleidoscope turning, still hides in the deep past, waiting for some future discovery to finally reveal it. So we have travelled across the world, from the silent buried stones of Gobekli Tepe to the shifting sands of the Sahara, from the cuneiform clay of Sumer to the carved stelae of Mesoamerica, from the banks of the Yellow River to the deep time of Aboriginal Dreamtime. And everywhere, in every corner of every continent, we find the same pattern, a narrative of destruction, a great flood, a sudden darkness, a world consumed by water or fire, and then a reset, a wiping away of what was, followed by a new beginning. A fresh start for humanity, seeded by a few survivors who carried the memory of what came before. It is staggering when you lay it all out together. Sumeria tells us that kingship descended from heaven before the flood, and had to be lowered again after. Egypt whispers of Zep Tepi, a golden age of gods that was swallowed by catastrophe, requiring the world to be rebuilt. Genesis describes a creator washing the earth clean, starting over with a single family on a mountain. India preserves the story of Manu pulled to safety by a fish while the waters swallowed everything he knew. China recounts the torrents that nearly ended all life, and the generations of labour required to tame them. The Popol Vuh speaks of wooden people destroyed by a flood sent by the gods, their descendants fashioned from true maize. Native American nations from the Pacific coast to the Great Lakes describe waters that rose without warning. And in Australia, the Dreamtime records a time when the land itself was reshaped by a great inundation. Every continent, every major cultural tradition, something similar. But why? This question sits at the very heart of one of the most fascinating debates in anthropology and folklore studies. Are we looking at the scattered echoes of a single, shared, real historical trauma? Or are we witnessing something more fundamental about the human mind? A universal storytelling pattern that emerges wherever people try to make sense of a dangerous and unpredictable world. Let us consider the first possibility. The shared trauma memory hypothesis proposes that around 4200 BCE, a global or near-global catastrophe actually occurred, one that profoundly disrupted human populations everywhere they existed. Survivors of this event, scattered across the globe, carried the visceral memory of what they had lived through. Floods that swallowed settlements, droughts that starved entire regions, skies that darkened and stayed dark. These memories were so powerful, so deeply traumatic, that they became the central organizing principle of every culture that descended from those survivors. Over thousands of years, the details shifted. Languages changed. Local geography reshaped the narratives, turning a distant volcanic eruption into a local flood, or a prolonged drought into a cosmic judgment. But the core structure survived. Destruction by water or fire. A few survivors. A new world rising from the wreckage. If this hypothesis is correct, then these myths are not just stories. They are history, distorted and mythologized by millennia of oral transmission, but still carrying the signature of a real event. Then there is the second possibility. The universal storytelling hypothesis argues that flood and reset myths arise independently because water and destruction are universal human experiences. Every early human settlement depended on water, which meant every early human settlement was vulnerable to flooding. Rivers overflow, coasts storm, lakes swell. When people tell stories about the worst thing they can imagine, they imagine water overwhelming their world. Similarly, every culture experiences loss, upheaval, and the need to rebuild. The narrative of destruction and renewal may simply be the most natural way humans process the cycles of their own existence. Under this view, the global pattern of flood myths is not evidence of a single event, but evidence of a single human psychology, a shared cognitive architecture that produces similar stories when faced with similar existential anxieties. How do we weigh these possibilities? Oral tradition provides a crucial bridge between them. We know that oral cultures can preserve historical information for astonishing lengths of time, sometimes thousands of years, but they do not preserve it like written records. Details shift, timelines compress or expand, motives become moralized. Real geological events become acts of divine will, a regional disaster becomes a world-ending cataclysm. The medium of oral transmission inherently distorts, but it does not necessarily erase. It preserves structure, sequence, and emotional resonance, even as it reshapes specifics. This means that a myth could contain a genuine historical core, even if its surface details have been entirely transformed. The Sumerian flood could be a real Mesopotamian inundation, mythologically expanded to fill the whole earth. The Australian Dreamtime flood could reflect a genuine post-glacial sea level rise, remembered and reshaped across 40,000 years of storytelling. What about a single shared global cause? The arguments in favour draw their strength from the simultaneity and structural similarity of the traditions. It is not just that many cultures have flood myths. It is that so many of them place those myths at the same narrative moment, the boundary between an older age and the current one, the moment when the world as we know it was established. The Sumerian king list draws a hard line between pre-flood and post-flood. Egypt draws a hard line between Zep Tepi and the historical dynasties. Genesis draws a hard line between the world of Adam and the world of Noah. This structural convergence suggests something more than random independent invention. The arguments against a single global cause emphasize the difficulty of explaining how an event in 4200 BCE could be remembered by cultures that did not yet exist in their current forms, or by populations separated by vast oceans and tens of thousands of years. They point out that local flood events happen constantly, providing ample raw material for independent myth-making without any need for a shared global trigger. So where does this leave us? Perhaps not at a firm conclusion, but at a productive and deeply intriguing uncertainty. The pattern is real. The myths are too widespread, too structurally similar, and too specifically placed at the boundary of ages to be dismissed as coincidence. But the mechanism of their transmission, whether by shared memory of a single catastrophe, or by convergent psychological response to local disasters, remains open. It is possible that both forces were at work. A genuine global disruption in 4200 BCE could have provided the initial seed of trauma, while universal human storytelling tendencies could have nurtured that seed into the varied but recognizable myths we find today. The truth may not be one or the other. It may be both, intertwined across millennia, the real and the mythological woven together so tightly that no archaeologist or folklorist can ever fully untangle them. And perhaps that is where the deepest fascination lies, not in a definitive answer, but in the haunting resonance of a story that every continent chose to remember, in its own way, in its own words, but always with the same essential shape. Something ended, something began, and we are still telling the tale. So we arrive at the end of this journey, carrying with us the echoes of a world that may have been reset. We have walked across continents, listening to the stories that every culture chose to preserve. From the clay tablets of Mesopotamia to the Dreamtime songs of Australia. From the first time of Egypt to the great waters of China and the Americas. Everywhere the same pattern emerged, a world undone. A few survivors clinging to something solid, and then, slowly, a new beginning. It is a pattern that humbles us if we let it. It suggests that human memory may stretch much further back than we typically assume, further than written records, further than dynasties and kingdoms, perhaps reaching towards something that actually happened to our ancestors, something so profound that it became permanently lodged in the human imagination. Or it suggests that the human mind itself carries a deep architecture, a universal way of processing the terrifying reality that our world can change in an instant, that everything we have built can be swept away, and that we must begin again. Whichever interpretation you lean toward, or whether you find yourself somewhere in between, the evidence we have explored tonight invites you to sit with the question rather than rush to resolve it. There is something valuable in that uncertainty, something that keeps the mystery alive and keeps us listening to the past with open minds. So I invite you now to form your own interpretation of what we have uncovered. Let the parallels resonate. Let the possibilities remain open. These ancient voices do not demand that we choose a single answer. They only ask that we remember them. If this journey through deep time and ancient memory has given you something worth holding, I would be grateful if you liked this video and shared your thoughts in the comments. I always read them, and they help this community grow. I would also love to know where you are listening from tonight. Whether you're in a quiet room in Tokyo, a small town in Norway, a flat in Buenos Aires, or anywhere else on this planet that carries its own flood stories, leave a comment and let me know. It is remarkable to think of all of us, scattered across the world, contemplating the same ancient question as we prepare for sleep. If you enjoy these stories and want to support the channel in the most meaningful way, the best method is to listen on Spotify. The link is in the description, and listening there helps sustain this work and allows us to keep exploring these deep mysteries together. So, as we close tonight, let the echoes settle. The myths remain. The questions remain. The stories that every continent chose to tell about a world that ended and a world that began again remain, waiting for whoever is curious enough to listen. Whatever actually happened in 4200 BCE, whatever force reset the course of human civilization, its reverberations are still with us, woven into the oldest stories we know. Sleep well tonight, knowing that you are part of a lineage that survived whatever came, and that carried the memory forward across oceans, across mountains, across time itself, until it reached you here, now, in the quiet of the night.